I just completed phase 2 of my layout, and the videos are scattered all over this past year and a half of videos. So I thought I would compile them into one massive video so that you could watch them at your leisure, just put them on the background while you're working, just some nice noise to have. So here it is, the entire building of my layout. Now, if you want to go into individual parts, I will be creating a playlist for this, so be on the lookout for that. I've built the first module of my new model railroad. This module is a T-Trak end cap module by Klondike's. You saw me build this module a little while back. I'll link the module down below and the video where I built it at the end of this video. We're making this module to appear that the tracks cut through the rolling hills of western North Carolina. We're going to start with some Sculptamold. Sculptamold is an amazing material that you can easily mold into any landscape the shape that you want. All you do is mix it up in some water and apply. I drew my area that I wanted to apply with a pen and then mix it up and apply the Sculptamold. Now, one thing I would do differently is I would put some paper or cardboard as the base structure of the hills and then apply the Sculptamold on top, because this stuff is quite heavy. Kind of think of like a plaster level of heavy. Now, this is noted for next time. Once I have applied the Sculptamold, I let it dry. Another reason to use a different structure material is that all of the Sculptamold took 2 days to fully dry. Next, I paint the entire top of the module, and I'm able to make quick work of this by taking it outside and spray painting it. This is another thing that I like about modules. They're easy to spray paint because you can just take them outside into a safe space. Whether if you have a permanent layout, you're kind of limited on your use of spray paint because of the fumes. I did tape the track to protect it. You can spray paint it if you want, but I did not. If you do, just remember to clean those rails thoroughly. Get the tops of those rails and get the connection points between the next module, because you don't want any electrical outages with it. Once that is dry, I can work on the track. One of the big drawbacks of Kato Unitrack is that it takes more work to make look truly realistic. That said, it can totally be done. I start by putting some white glue on the side of the roadbed. I then put some Woodland Scenics fine grade ballast on the spot that I glued. Note that I did not put it on top of the track. That is for later. I used some various brushes to neaten up the ballast, and now I can do the top. This is where Kato track gets a little bit tedious if you want it to look right. I take a bamboo skewer and dip it in the glue and put a tiny dot on the spots in between the ties. Now, you don't have to use a bamboo skewer. I like using it. You can use something like a micro brush as well. I also put glue down in between the ends of the ties on the outside of the rails as well. This is really where working on a module versus an entire layout really shines. It could take you an hour to do an entire module this way, whereas an entire layout's going to take a lot longer. I then sprinkle the ballast on top of the track. I then use a soft bristle brush to spread the ballast between the ties. You may need to practice this, as you can clump it with the glue and you'll need to be gentle. That's why you don't want to use too much glue in between the track. I then use my finger to smooth out the ballast, and you don't want to press too hard, just kind of use it to get it off the top of the ties, and that's going to help you out in a big way. Any ballast left on top, I use the blunt sides of a utility knife to scrape off the tops of the ties. You'll want to give as much as you can off the top of the ties and from inside the web of the rail, which is the little skinny part of the rail. The utility knife or a good hobby knife can help with this. Take your time and do this right. You will not regret it. By slowing down and making sure everything looks right, you're going to have a fantastic end product. Once I am done, I soak the ballast with a 91% isopropyl alcohol. This is to break the surface tension and let the glue seep into all of the scenic material. Now, you can get away with using 70%. I've used 70% IPA in the past and it's been fine, but that's about as low as I would go. 90% and higher is really, really good for this. It also dries pretty quick too. I then cover everything with my DIY scenic cement, which is basically just a white glue and water mixture, and I let it dry overnight. Now that I have the track done, it's time to add some realism. One of the best things you can do to make model railroad track more realistic is to make it dirty in the middle, especially mainline tracks. The middle of railroad tracks gets dirty from all the dirt and grime that falls off trains as they pass. This could be material from the bottoms of hopper cars, oil and grime from locomotives, anything really. The thing that it does is it makes the middle of the rails darker. To accomplish this, I'm going to be grinding up some pastel chalks and applying them to the tracks. I grab a large piece of mid-grade sandpaper, so about 120 grit, and I grind these pastels into a fine powder. I start with brown and then go to black. Once I have grinded them, I use a soft bristle brush to apply the powder to the track. I do this in kind of a gentle way where I will just literally kind of tap it and then slowly work it back and forth until I actually am touching, and then I spread it, because if you don't, it can kind of do like an uneven splotching. I did do a little bit of brown at the beginning, but really what made it pop was the black, and I really laid that on. This simple thing just really makes the rails pop, and it just makes it's such a simple thing that you can do, and it makes it look so much better. Next, it was time for the scenic base. I start by coating the entire module that does not have track on it with white glue. I then spread some Woodland Scenics blended turf earth blend all over it, covering as much as I can. Now note that I did not get the glue coating too close to the track, and when I spread the scenery at the track, I hold the cap away from the track so that I get a fairly crisp line where the scenery meets the ballast. This is also so that I get a nice crisp line of track with the ballast and everything, and keeping the glue off means that even if I do mess up, that I will be able to fix it pretty easily. Once that was done, I realized that I had some spots of plastic showing through from the Kato Unitrack, so I fixed those with some additional light ballasting, let those dry, and then weathered those spots as well, and that was a little bit just more of the powder and the same thing that you just saw. Once I have covered the entire layout, I come back with some darker green fine turf and sprinkle it unevenly over the earth blend. This gives the look of uneven vegetation because in nature, not everything is a uniform green. I then come back and then lightly sprinkle some lighter green fine turf over it to get a little bit of contrast, and that makes it pop a little bit more. Once this is done, I soak the entire module in IPA and scenic cement and let it dry overnight. Kind of getting a theme of here of when in doubt, let it dry overnight. Now for the fun part. We're going to build a section of forest on this module. Now in the past for this, you've seen me use something like super trees and puffball trees for this, and those are fantastic and great ways to make forest canopies. And I really do love them, but I wanted to use something that was a little bit easier to find for people and comes in more of a starter kit type thing. And if you're just beginning, it is a little bit easier to use than super trees can be. And that is Woodland Scenics Forest Canopy. It comes with dry sedum versus the seafoam of super trees. It also comes with scenic cement and the coarse turf needed to coat the trees. And a box is about 20 bucks, and for this module I'm going to be using 2 boxes to make the entire module covered in trees for what I want. One is going to be the medium green forest canopy and one is going to be the dark green forest canopy. This product is multi-scale, so I start by breaking the sedum stems into smaller pieces that will fit better with N-scale. Remember that you want to vary the size of your trees you are making. Once that is done, I can start turning these stems into trees. Now through various trial and error, through various attempts, I have come up with a 3-container system for making trees like this. One contains the scenic cement, one has all of the flocking material, and one is empty. I start by dunking the tree in the scenic cement and giving it good and cover with it from about the top to about 1/3 to halfway down. I then hold it over the empty container and either sprinkle or pour the flocking material over the tree. This method really allows for speed and a reduction of waste. Less material is lost to excess glue, and you can catch the material for easy reuse. Once one container is empty, the container's reverse rolls and you go back and forth until you are out of material. Then it's just rinse and repeat for making trees. For placing trees, I use a pin vise with a drill bit the approximate size of the average tree. I just kind of figure that out and eyeball it, and then drill holes in either clusters of 3 or 5. Odd numbers are good for giving a sense of randomness when you're putting in trees. When I'm ready to place the tree, I put some white glue on the hole that I drilled and stick the tree in. Then I just do that over and over and over and over and over again until I have the coverage that I want. Okay, we are nearly done. The last thing we need to do is add some unkempt vegetation on the banks coming down from the forest to the track. I put some white glue in the spots that I'm working on. I start off by using some of the leftover clumps that were created from making the trees that are in the Tupperware containers. This is just where some glue dripped down and they kind of clumped together, and it's kind of a happy accident where some of the branches broke off and give us this really good look of just unkempt vegetation and just a natural look that's kind of hard to achieve when you're really trying to make it yourself. Once I've used up all of that, I switch to using Woodland Scenic's foliage mats. These are mats of foliage material that you can tear apart and shape. They're great for things like overgrowth and kudzu too. I start ripping the sheets apart while holding them inside one of the Tupperware containers so that they catch any of the material that falls off, which will become useful later, so keep watching for that. I apply it to various places using white glue to hold it in. Now this stuff can be a bit tricky and you can look like you have a hard edge of it. When you see one and you don't like it, just put your finger down and pull the edge apart and really just tease it into the shape you like. You also want to get it good and tucked in under the trees so that it looks like it doesn't just stop at the trees. You want to just kind of push it in there underneath those trees. Okay, I've got all of the foliage mats in place and I have all of the excess that fell off during the process in my Tupperware. I'm going to spread this along the edges and in between so that it can blend the mats with the rest of the scenery and make it look more natural. Once I have everything in place, I soak the entire module with IPA, and since this is a mobile module, I go a little overboard on the scenic cement, just to make sure that everything holds in place. And now, I can let it dry. And here is the final result. T-Trak straight modules are created to fit 310 millimeters of straight track, which is the longest section of straight track that Kato makes, which is the double crossover. Now, a double crossover is something that would need some fairly complex signaling, and we're going to wire that up using an Arduino to run that. Now, this is a Klondike's module that I'm using. It's a single module, and it's got a nice little wire hole in the back, which is going to come in handy later. Let's start with the track and signal installation. First is obviously the double crossover, Kato part 2210. Then I'm using these double signals from the We Honest eBay store. I will link them in the description below. I've bought many signals from them and they have all been great. Once we figure out where everything needs to go, we can start the install. Now, I want to give a shout out to one of my viewers, Keith, who's an engineer for BNSF. He helped me with the proper signal placement, and now I'm going to get these as close as I can to the proper place on the module because it doesn't quite allow me to get there. Once I have the spots marked, I can drill out the holes for the signals as well as the wire for the turnout. I would check your bits once you get one and just get one to the closest size of this. The parts of the signal that go in are threaded and it comes with nuts for tightening them on, so you don't have to get it exact. Once you have all the holes drilled, you can put the signals on. Now you basically have to screw these on, so you have to twist them kind of gently, and I do thread the wires first before I start twisting the signals, and again, make sure you twist that signal carefully. I also lift the modules so the wires can flow freely as I turn the signal, so they don't get tangled nearly as much as they would, because there are 8 wires coming out of each signal, and that's a lot. Once that is done, I cut the connector on the double crossover and feed the wire through. I'm not gluing down the track just yet, we'll do that in a little bit. Now we can start the Arduino part of the build. You're going to need an Arduino Mega for this build, because I will be using 26 outputs for this. That's 24 for the signals and 2 for the switch motor. You'll also need an L298N motor driver, some wires with DuPont connectors, 2 12-position terminal strips, 1 4-position terminal strip, and I'll also be using some momentary push buttons to trigger the crossover, and you'll need some 470 ohm resistors for that. All of these parts will be listed in the description below. I'll also have a schematic linked below, because this is going to be a whirlwind installation that, no matter how hard I've tried, is not going to be the easiest thing to follow. So we'll use the schematic in tandem with the install video. The first thing that I do is set out to determine which wires go to which. I do this by tapping the wires on the ends of a 5-volt power supply to see what lights up. I then tape together each set of wires so I know which one's which. I also put like a little T and B for top and bottom on the signals. I then set out to position everything where it will work best. And once I have that figured out, I start by wiring each of the 12-position terminal strips. I use the male end of the DuPont wires to clamp into the strips, and this works really well. I'm using male-to-male DuPont connectors so that I can just slide them into the Arduino slots. Since I'm going to have a ton of wires, I try to keep the DuPont wires connected the best I can because they come in little ribbons. For the top signals, I'm using red, yellow, and green. For the bottom ones, I'm using blue, purple, and gray because they come together. Blue is for red, purple is for yellow, and gray is for green. I also mark each signal 1 through 8 once I have the terminal strips in. After doing this, I wire up the 4-position strip. I put 1 positive connection on each side and 2 button connections in the middle. I have some future plans for this module that include some modifications, so I just want to be able to update the Arduino program without doing serious hardware work. Next, I can wire up the L298M motor driver with its connection to the Arduino. The power for the entire mechanism is going through the motor driver, so the Arduino will take its power from the 5-volt output and send the signal to control it back through the input pins. Once I have everything pre-wired as much as possible, I start attaching components using hot glue. Now it's just a matter of connecting all the signal wires to the terminal positions and the terminal positions to the Arduino. The signals are as follows. Signals 1 through 4 are on one strip, and signals 5 through 8 are on another strip. Signals 1 and 2, which are the first inside signal pole, are here. Signal 1 uses pins 4, 5, and 6 for red, yellow, and green respectively. Signal 2 uses pins 7, 8, and 9 for red, yellow, and green respectively. And this keeps going in succession through all 8 signals. You should end up with the final green being on pin 27. Next, you'll connect the black power wires to the 5-volt terminals of the 4-position strips. That's the ones you've done on each end. And then connect those 5-volt pins to the Arduino. This is also where the buttons will attach. I will connect the button to one of the 5-volt terminals on one of its wires. Then I'll split the other wire between analog input A0 and the Arduino ground connection. And this is where you'll need to put a 470 ohm resistor in between the button and that ground connection. And then if you do a second button, which I plan on doing, you'll do the same thing, except that wire will go to A1 instead of A0. I then connect the input 1 and input 2 pins on the L298M motor driver to pins 2 and 3 on the Arduino, and connect the ground and 5-volt pins from the motor driver to the ground and VIN pins on the Arduino. This is how we're powering everything from that motor driver. Now, once all of that is done, I can connect all of the signal light wires to those terminal strips. This just makes it so much easier versus having to figure out how to connect those wires directly to the Arduino. And you'll notice that these also have resistors pre-wired in them, so there's no need to add any resistors to the signal wires. I then connect the crossover control wires to output 1 and 2 on the motor driver. Then all you need to do is connect some power to it. I'm using a 12 volt 1 amp power supply connected to the 12 volt and ground pins on the motor driver, and I'm using a barrel plug adapter for this. Now I can load the Arduino program. This Arduino program has a lot of code, and frankly, it would take me a long time to go through all of it. I have a download available from my GitHub page that I have linked in the description below. Also, this is the base version of this. I intend to add a lot more complexity to it. Right now, it only shows straight and diverging is aligned and is not prototypically accurate, but that is coming. I want to eventually get to a point where you can cycle through which signal is showing clear, and even I've left room for the Arduino to get information from adjacent signal blocks like my Arduino multi-block signal system. I also want to add modifications for different turnout motors, which actually would not be that difficult. So think about this with a couple of tortoises or some regular snap switch motors, things like that. So you can download the Arduino sketch, open it up, and load it into the Arduino. If you're having trouble with this and you've never done this before, I have linked a how-to video on loading programs to an Arduino right here. Once all this is done, I can finally test my setup. Now that I've seen it works, I can use hot glue to secure all of my Arduino connections in place, and here is the final result. So, there you go. I built this T-Trak module with a double crossover and put signals on it. When I did that video, I did not have the code quite right to make it prototypical. Well, I have the code working a lot better now, and the module looks like this. Let me show you how I did this. Let's get to it. This module was a personal favorite to build. It has been a truly interesting process. I learned some new coding, including how to do Arduino libraries, and I am even attempting to match it to my first completed module so that there's very little visible of the seam between the two modules. Let's start with the code. Now, I'm not going to go all the way through it because it is a lot of code. But what it does is basically allows you to set one direction or the other as clear when the crossover is aligned straight. And then when it's set to diverge, you can pick which direction is clear by cycling through the signals using this button. I accomplished this using libraries in Arduino. These are pretty complex to explain, so I will put my code up in the description below, as well as a link to the video that helped me learn how to do this right up here. And here is the module in action. Okay, now to the detail process. The first thing we need to do is figure out where our hillside from the other module is going to fade out on this module. We line up the modules and draw a line with a Sharpie. I then grab some Sculptamold and form the hillside. Sculptamold is a great material for shaping small hills like this, but for larger hills, use things like foam or cardboard and then put the Sculptamold just on top as a coating. This stuff is expensive and it's heavy. Once that was done, I let the Sculptamold dry overnight. The next day, I grabbed some brown acrylic paint and painted the top of the module brown to simulate some dirt. I used a small brush to paint around the track and the signals. Now you can do some painter's tape. I was confident enough in my abilities to be able to do this, and if I got a little paint on the roadbed, that was totally fine. But I used a foam brush to handle the rest. Foam brushes are great for painting Sculptamold because you can get into all the little nooks and crannies. Now I could have mixed the Sculptamold with the paint to skip this whole process, but it would have also taken a lot more paint to get the same color with the amount that I was using. I let the paint dry and I could begin the scenery process. I start with the ballast. Because this is a crossover, I will not be ballasting over the ties in order to not risk the mechanism of the turnouts, because Kato's mechanism for controlling the turnouts remotely is entirely internal to the turnout. I'll be working on that later. I ballast the sides with my usual process of glue, then I ballast it, then I soak it with isopropyl alcohol, then I use my 50-50 white glue water mixture, and then I let it dry. By the way, in case it's your first time seeing one of my videos, the isopropyl alcohol breaks the surface tension and allows the glue to seep in, so you're just not doing any gluing on the top and getting weird clumps. While that is going on, I can start on the other scenery. Before I do the base, I want to make a gravel access road to the signals. I will be using Woodland Scenics gravel to do this. Now this comes in two parts. It comes with the little gravel, the fine ballast, and then it also comes with a dirt to mix over it. I paint the road in glue just to get my shape down, and then I do the gravel mixture and then clean it up a little bit. And once it dries, I'm going to add the dirt onto it at that point. Once this is done, I can do the scenic base, which I cover the module in glue and sprinkle scenery turf on it. I start with the earth blend from Woodland Scenics, and then I sprinkle over some various greens to give it that nice uneven look. Remember that the scenery in real life is not going to be a uniform green. It's going to be a mixture of browns and greens and even some grays, who knows. But once that is done, I soak it again with a 90% IPA and then use the 50-50 mixture, and I let it dry. Once this is done, I add some underbrush using these foliage mats and clump foliage from JTT Scenery. This scenery material actually can be picked up at Hobby Lobby, which is where I got mine. I just ran out and grabbed it really fast. This is where it's really about a creative eye. Go until it feels right, then soak it with your IPA and 50-50 glue mixture to set it. One thing I do is I put underbrush along the edges to help blend the seams of the module, and you'll see where that comes in handy a little bit later. Once it is dry enough, I can add some trees. I am once again using Woodland Scenics Forest Canopy Kits so that I can better match the end cap module. You've seen me do this process before, and I will link the video that I did this at the end of this video. Basically, it comes with sedum stems, and you dip them in the included scenic cement, cover it in the included coarse turf, and plant it. I usually drill small holes using like a pin vise or something in the sculpted mold to plant the trees, adding a little glue to hold it in place. After all this is done, I can add some dirt to the gravel now that it's dried enough, and I can let this all finally dry out. So now we have a fully scenic module, but we need to blend it with the first module. So let's do that. We start off by connecting the modules. It's just simple Kato Unitrack snaps together. We can still see some of the sculpt mold on the side, and the seam is still very obvious. So we're going to start off by taking some of the leftover underbrush and put that right up against the seam and then have glue on beneath it. This makes the transition a bit less jarring. Now, with all of this material, you're basically going to go until this looks right. And I'm just using all sorts of spare grab material that I've used on either this module or the first module, and I'm just kind of getting the feel and making sure it looks right. And I want to get the vegetation also as close to the track as I can with it looking natural, because this also helps mask the seam even better. You'll notice at this point that I'm only seeing the seam really at the track itself, which is my ultimate goal. Now, after all that is done, you can let it dry. Lastly, we are going to use my pastel chalk technique for weathering and use black pastel chalk to ground up over the track and brush it in with a bit of brown as well. This is so we can blend it not only the ballast and the plastic together, but we can also blend the two modules together. And here it is. This is my largest T-Trak module to date. We're doing a T-Trak triple. Hey, alliteration. Let's get into it. What I just showed you is my new module for my next layout. It is a T-Trak triple module from Klondike's. I put a link in the description to that. I am building my first industry for this layout as well. This module represents an industrial area east of Elkin, North Carolina, where several industries are present. Now, I have already attached the track using a T-Trak gauge and wired it for those track-powered signals that I showed you guys a little while back. I'll link that video at the end of this video. We start by painting the module a brown color. For this, I'm using just some basic standard acrylic paint that you can find in most craft sections. I'm okay with getting a little bit of paint on the unit track, but if you're not, you can just tape the track off. Just be careful of those turnout controls. Once that is done, I need to do the asphalt for the parking area and industry. To do this, I'm going to be painting a sheet of thin styrene, just like this one. And here is a little tip for buying cheap thin styrene like this. Buy for sale signs. They're cheap and they work just as well. Plus, you can buy singles rather than packs like this at places like Walmart. Okay, that was a little dumb. Let's just move on. In order to get the right size piece, I bring the piece in and mark the points where I need to cut so that I can fit it like a puzzle piece next to the track and be flush against the back of the module as well. I'm using a rolling cutter to make these cuts, but you can use anything that can make a good cut, like a utility knife or a hobby knife. If you are a kid by chance, then make sure you just ask for your parents' permission and have them help you, because you can cut yourself pretty easy. I've done that. Once this is done, it's time to paint the asphalt. Now, one thing I see a lot of people do is paint a road straight black, and this is totally fine if you don't care too much, but if you want some more accurate colors to real life, you can use this simple spray paint technique. Now, I kind of made a goof when I was recording this. I wasn't rolling when I painted the road surface. I did what is known in the industry as a double punch, where I accidentally hit the record button twice. So I'm going to demonstrate on this scrap section of the same sheet. I start with some gray. I'm using some Krylon Shortcuts matte gray for the base, and once I have everything gray, I can come back with flat black spray paint, more of those Krylon Shortcuts, and do these short little bursts and move in quick motions around the surface. I go until I feel it looks right. I'm going for kind of like a some places are more worn than other type look. Now that I have painted the road surface, I can glue it in place just using some simple white glue. Once that is done, I can do some ballasting. Kato is a unique product to ballast. There is Kato Unitrack ballast, which matches the plastic, but I just tend to use Woodland Scenic's medium gray ballast, and it works pretty well after some blending. I do my usual of white glue on the track, then adding ballast, brushing it in place, and then soaking it with IPA, and then my homemade scenic cement. While that is drying, I can start applying more scenery. The first thing I'm going to do is just at the beginning of a hill at the opposite side. For this, I'm going to be using some of that terracotta modeling clay from Crayola. This is just something I wanted to try. This is the same stuff that I used on those Kato mini dioramas. I'm actually going to try to scenic this stuff before it dries, just to see if it'll work. Also, so I can stick some of those Woodland Scenics forest canopy trees in it. So first I apply white glue to grab the scenic material, and then I can apply a blended earth scenic mix. Now this one is from JTT Scenery because I did a lot of stock up for this project from Hobby Lobby, but you can use the Woodland Scenics products or Scenic Express, whatever you like. Then I can use some of the various green scenic mixes to mix over the earth blend. I go dark, then light, And then once this is done, I can apply some IPA and scenic cement and then start making and placing the woodland scenic forest canopy trees. Now I have done this in the past 2 modules, and I'm trying to keep a consistent look so it looks good throughout the project. So I'm going to link the module that I did a ton of these in at the end of this video. Now, in order for these trees to stand up, I do have to use some clips to hold them in place while they dry. So I did a few large anchor trees, and then I started placing smaller pre-made trees around the edges of the wooded corner. And as those trees dry, I remove the clips and add more and more scenery. Now I need to blend the sidings and the road surface, and I'm doing this by starting with some Woodland Scenics dirt, and I use this at various spots. I blend these with different materials, and I use some of this tan ballast to act as an edge for the road surface as it transitions to the dirt. There is a lot of rinse and repeat all over the layout for doing this scenery. Next up, I really needed to weather and blend the track. So what I needed to do was do what I did for the last few sections, but I wanted to try a different product. And this is because I was walking around Hobby Lobby in those couple of aisles where we get all our scenic materials if we need to go grab something quick. And I saw this. This is a Hobby Lobby braided weathering set. There was actually a couple of different ones, and I bought this one. And this one has snow, soot, and rust in it, and it's about $5. And when you open it up, it has 3 different things in it. I've already been using it heavily. And then it has a little brush. First of all, the brush for this particular thing did not work that well, and I ended up just using a regular brush like this. But you just kind of ground it in like that, and you'll have something that kind of goes everywhere, so you'll just probably end up sweeping it off. But I just do like that, and then I just mix it on there and start weathering away with the track. Now, one thing I did need to do, because I'm trying to blend the areas where the modules come together, is I need to make a bush line that's going to match the bushes on the adjacent module it will be attached to. The last thing I need to do is add some underbrush and shrubbery all around the natural area. I do this randomly, and then I coat it with IPA and scenic cement. Now, this module is going to use buildings that I still have on my current layout, so I'm not quite ready to tear this down, and I can't put them on the layout permanently. But I can arrange them in a way so that they can be on the module so you can see what it's going to look like when I permanently install them. Here you go. We're officially halfway on phase 1 of the new layout. Now, I'm going to detail that whole scene around the little industry in one of those new mini project videos on coffee and trains in one of the next few months. Now, the next module is going to be the other end cap module in phase 1, and I promise that is going to be unlike anything you've seen me try before. Yeah. We're building that today. I have had the Broadway Limited Layout Lightning Storm sitting in a box for a while now. I've been wanting to add it to my layout, but then I thought, hey, what if I added it to a T-Trak module for my new layout? I have another end cap on phase 1 of my new layout, and this was the perfect spot for it. So let's get started. First, we need to get the module prepped. I do this by painting the top of it the same brown as the rest of my layout. I'm not too careful about the edges because I eventually intend to paint the sides black. I then attach the track. For this, I'm using a bit of super glue, which works just fine. You can use whatever glue you want. You can really just use something like latex caulk, which is another one that I've used in the past. I use a short section of Kato double track to check my alignments. Now this is the Klondike's module, and it has the laser lines etched into them for where you need to put the center line of the track. Once I've got that done, I glue all of the Kato unitrack down. Next, it's time to get out the layout lightning storm. Now this thing consists of a speaker with all of the electronics in it, a button, 2 LED strips, and a power supply. We start off by screwing the speaker onto the module. Now it has a foam insert that goes between the speaker and the surface to help dampen any vibrations the sound may cause on your railroad. Once this is done, I attach 2 floral foam cylinders to the module using glue. I'm going to be using floral wire to hold up and build the frame of the Thunderstorm. So floral foam is perfect for supporting this. Now I use this E6000 glue, which I saw in Hobby Lobby, and I thought it'd be interesting to try, and it was okay, but I would probably use something else in the future that was a bit quicker setting, like a high temp hot glue or super glue. Once this was done, I built a support structure for the cloud with floral wire sections. I basically built it high enough and then created a quarter sphere to put the cloud on. Next up, I placed the LED strips in the rough position I wanted them. Now they're going to move around until they're secured in with the cloud structure. And now I can do my first test of the system. Next, I attach the control button to the front fascia. I marked where to drill a hole for the wires. I drilled the hole, then fed it through and attached the button with some glue. Now it has screw terminals, but the glue worked just fine for me. I just went along the edges with the super glue so that I didn't have to worry about the back getting ripped off. I also drilled a hole near the speaker for wires to run through as well, so that you can have some nice wire paths underneath the module. Now for another test. Now it's time to build the mountain that will cover the speaker. Now I'm going to be using the cardboard webbing method, which uses cardboard strips to create the frame, then is covered with plaster cloth. And while I'm doing this, you can actually hear my kids think how cool this Thunderstorm is when it was going on its random cycle. Now you'll notice that I'm testing this thing with every step that I complete. This is important because you want to make sure that everything works as you go along, because if you do something that causes it not to work, you'll know as soon as you clear the step. Once the plaster is dry, I can paint the hillside with the same paint I use on the module base. Once this is done and dry, I can start the scenic process, and this begins with ballasting. I do my usual application of ballasting and weathering the track process that I've done in the past, and I'm going to link the other end cap module where I go over this entire thing in detail at the end of this video, so you can check that out if you're interested in that, or if you have your own ballast method, you can use that as well. I then soak everything with a 90% IPA and use my white glue water mixture to get everything secured down. Now you can see that I'm using a syringe to put the IPA down and a squeeze bottle to apply the glue. Some people are going to think that I'm crazy for doing this versus a mister bottle or a spray bottle, but this has consistently given me the best results that last. Yes, it is significantly more tedious, but I typically only have to do it once. Now while that's drying, I move on to the scenic base off the track, and this starts with a white glue coating. I then cover everything with an earth blend of scenic turf foam. Note how I hold the edge of the cap I am using so that I can get a fairly clean line where the scenery meets the ballast. After the base is done, I sprinkle a mixture of green turf foams on the earth blend to give it a good mix. This is an easy way to get a natural, good-looking ground on your layout because a lot of times nature is not a uniform color. It's a good mixture of colors. You have weeds, you have all sorts of other plants, and this will give you that illusion. Now to cover the mountain. I'm going back to an old technique for this one. I'm talking about first few videos I did on the channel, and this one is going to be reindeer moss or lichen. You can pick this up in quite a lot of places. Woodland Scenics has their own varieties of it, but you can also find it in Hobby Lobby, you can find it in Walmart, just anywhere that has a floral section. I've even seen it in the dollar store. And it is great for quick and easy tree-covered hillsides. I've purchased 2 different colors, and as I attach them, I mix them through the hillside. The reason I'm going for this method is that the hillside is pretty steep and the track is fairly close. Puffball trees, which is what I probably would have done, would have had too much depth and probably obstructed the track and been really a pain. So the reindeer moss option was my best bet, though it was a bit tough to keep attached on those vertical surfaces as it was drying. I'd have to keep pressing it back there. Once this was done, I needed to augment the reindeer moss with actual trees so that this looked more like a hillside. I did this with a couple of things. One was some leftover Woodland Scenics tree canopy trees that I had from a previous kit. Another was a couple of pre-made trees. I did this because I wanted some conifers on there to make it look a bit more of a mountainous feel, because I want this to represent as you're getting close to the mountains in North Carolina rather than a rolling hillside. The last technique was actually a little bit of recycling. I had some old super trees that I used a while back, and so I went through gluing them in random spots. So if you're ever using super trees or something similar and you're tearing down a section, stick all those in a box or a bag or whatever's best, because you can always use this to fill out and detail out a tree canopy that you're building, just like this. Once this was done, I did a similar but scaled down process for the small hillsides. Lastly, I needed to detail the ground near the track. Now I went around sprinkling various bits of scenic material, whether it is clump foliage or scenic turf or just any sort of scraps or coarse foam or anything like that, and some mats and all things that I have that were extras from previous projects, and this really comes in handy. I tend to scoop anything extra into a single Tupperware and let it all mix together. This lets me have a pre-made random mixture of foliage to scatter on the ground, and this greatly helps in making easy, natural beauty. So once everything was done, I soaked it all in IPA and my glue mixture. Now it's time to make the thunderstorm cloud. I want to give it the feeling of rolling over the mountain and into a valley below. If you've ever been to Boone, North Carolina and seen a storm roll over Rich Mountain, you know exactly what I am talking about. They come rolling down that thing. In order to do this, I'm going to use polyfill to create the clouds. This stuff is cheap and it looks great. This entire bag was about $3.50. This is the stuff you use to stuff pillows. I roll it into very rough balls, kind of like bigger versions of puffball trees, and I stick it through the floral wire. I do have to sometimes detach the floral wire to get this on, but it's easy to fix and twist right back together. I I keep building around the LED strips to make sure that the polyfill completely covers the LED strips, and once I had all of the wires filled, I add some to the top of the cloud and used a bit of spray glue to attach it. I also added a few more sections of floral wire as supports to keep the cloud stable. So, there you go. Let's take a look at how this model Thunderstorm looks. This is really a fun project. I've been wanting an animated feature on my layout, and I think this one is perfect. I made this entire backdrop with bulletin board paper, spray paint, foam core, and a for sale sign. How did I do it? Let's check it out. A lot of my projects are done not only to show you how to do it, but so that they are easy to replicate. Not everyone has the same skills, so taking that out of the equation as much as possible means more people can get the results they are happy with. And this project is a prime example of that. So let's get started on this backdrop. To start, we'll need to put together the foam core backing and get it to the right size. To begin with, we need 2 sections of foam core because the space it has to go in is longer than any single piece of it. We slide them into position and mark where to cut one of them so that it can fit in its space. The gap between the 2 sides is plenty wide enough for this foam core. Once these are cut, I can lay them out in place a wide piece of tape to hold them together, like masking tape. I would advise a lighter color than what I used with this painter's tape. It worked well, but there was a little bit of show through once I put the bulletin board paper on, so if you can, use lighter colored tape. Now that we have the backing done, we can put on our paper. Now I'm using non-glossy bulletin board paper, and that's important. I roll the paper over it. This is where we run into our first wrinkle in this project, and that pun was intended. We're going to glue the paper to the foam core. To do that, we're going to use spray adhesive. This helps avoid visible globs of glue underneath the paper. I'd cut out exactly what I need. This worked perfectly. Well, almost. You will have to work to get as many wrinkles out as you can. Once that is dried, we can test fit it again. Alright, we have a board constructed. Now it's time to paint it. This is where the spray paint and the for sale sign come in. I need to make clouds. Clouds can be difficult, but I've got a pretty simple way that makes it a whole lot easier. We start with a styrene for sale sign. We then draw a cloud shape coming out of the edges. Once we've done that, we use some scissors to cut out the cloud shape. Now, don't focus too hard on staying on your lines, but rather focus on smooth turns for the puffy parts of the clouds. I do one on each side of the sign so that I can mix them around and do a little bit of variety. Once this is done, I bring the sign and some flat white spray paint to the backdrop. I lay the backdrop down and do quick bursts of paint with these stencils, and these bursts are done about 4 to 6 inches off of the backdrop, and I do them left to right, right to left. Working my way down the cloud stencil, I don't go all the way to the bottom of the edge of where I cut it, but rather stop about 3/4 of the way. This will give us that faded cloud bottom look. And you always want to aim a little bit up and away from that edge so that you don't get any of that hard edge. But if you do get some of the hard edge, you can just do another part of the stencil and just put it over there, and it'll just make another part of the cloud. One thing I would recommend is get some of the scrap piece of bulletin board paper and do a little bit of practice on this before you do it on your backdrop for real. It helped me out, and it'll definitely help you out. Once I've got the clouds done, I test fit it to see how it looks. Next, it's time for some hillsides, and I've done the same thing for the hillsides by cutting a stencil out of a styrene for sale sign. I start with the back hills because they are a different color. You want them to be a little bit lighter of a color than what you're going to have for the hills that are closer to your foreground. This will just give the atmospheric look of, as something gets further away, it gets a little bit more faded. Once that is done, I switch to the darker color for closer hills. I'm going to pause right here because I did a little bit of an oopsie. I didn't let the back hill dry all the way before starting on the front hill, and that led to a little bit of splotching that I had to cover up with some more of the white spray paint in a technique. So if you do this, definitely make sure you let that back hill completely dry. Otherwise, you're going to get some splotchiness on the back side of your stencil that's going to spot. I do a little bit of tweaking and spot treatment to make sure I didn't mess anything up, and here you go. Is it the single most detailed and amazing photorealistic backdrop you've ever seen? No. But it's something that looks a lot better than what a lot of people can do just purely with a paintbrush and hoping for the best. Hopefully this process takes a lot of the challenge out of doing a backgrounds and can give you something that you really like as your backdrop for your model railroad. Backgrounds do not have to be a challenge. All you need are the right tools and materials, and you can make a solid backdrop for your layout. A while ago, I showed you these Shadowbox T-Trak modules from Artless Laser Kits. One is a full kit, and one is a diorama overhang add-on to any double module. Today, we're taking one of these and using it for the first module of the rural hall portion of the layout. This module has the overhang, which is also going to contain an LED light strip that I put on when I built it. The reason for this is that these modules will be further away from the main light sources of the layout, so I thought this would be the perfect place to put the diorama overhang with its own lighting. To begin, I start by painting the base with simple cheap acrylic paint. Now I've already done the installation of the track, the crossing, and the signal, and I've covered the signal and track in previous videos, and the crossing will be covered in an upcoming video for Trainmasters TV. The main thing is to make sure it is aligned with T-Trak standards. Once I have painted the base, I need to install the road. Now I'm not going for a perfect representation of rural hall. I'm going for a general look and feel as what can be seen from this angle on a street view on Google Earth. There are a couple of buildings, including one older town building and a transload track for multiple car types. Now, normally I would be creating all new roads, but I just salvaged a bunch from my old layout, so I can use that. My roads are typically polystyrene sheets and are spray painted with a mix of black and gray. These also have lines painted on them, and I use just acrylic paint and some painter's tape for that. Again, that's going to be linked in the description below, as well as at the end of this video. Now, real quick before we get into this, I've powered up the lights, and I want you to notice that they're a light strip. Those are adhesive LED strips, and you just pull off the cover on the back and you stick them on there. Now, one thing I did notice is that the adhesive did not hold that well to the wood, so adding a bit of super glue is holding them just fine now. Now I can start ballasting. Ballasting Color Unitrack can be a bit trickier. The key is to make the slopes of the ballast smooth and even. I start with some glue to hold it in place, then I pour the ballast gently over the sides, and then I use a brush to smooth it out. Once that is done, I soak it with isopropyl alcohol and then with a 50-50 white glue water mixture, which is my scenic cement mixture. Then I need to let that dry. While this is drying, I need to place my scenic base. As usual, I use an Earth Blend scenic material. This one is from JTT Scenery, but you can use something like Woodland Scenic's Earth Blend as well. I coat the area with glue, then cover it with the scenic base material. After that, I sprinkle some medium green fine turf over it just to get very uneven patchiness. Once that was done, it was time for some gravel. Now, the first place I wanted to put gravel was the edges of the roadways. I do this by pouring a small pile of Woodland Scenic's gravel on the road. I then use a brush to spread it out. This is a huge perk of using styrene sheets for roads, by the way. They're easy to clean and push stuff around on. The scenic material makes a reasonably good stop for the gravel, but don't get overzealous. Just gently form the line of gravel at the edge of the road. Next, I need to do the gravel lot for one of the buildings. I start by carefully pouring a line of gravel around the area that I want to make a lot. Then I fill in the space and gradually smooth and sculpt the material until it is to my liking. Once this is all done, I can soak all of the scenic material in IPA and scenic cement, then some medium and dark green coarse turf. Next, I need to put the backdrop on. Now, I found these really cool sky clouds poster boards at Michael's. I'll try to find some that I can link in the description. If nothing else, I'll link the Michael's ones. I took them, marked them based on putting them right next to the module so I can get my marks. Then I put it on the ground and use a straight edge and a utility knife to cut them to size. I then took the piece of backdrop and put it on the module as a test fit to make sure it was good to go. I then came back, put a little bit of super glue on the spots that I wanted to mount it, not too much, and then placed the backdrop on there and held it in place until it was dried on and ready to go. So that edge is pretty abrupt and we need to blend in that backdrop. I'm going to put a tree line on my backdrop using my recovered super trees from the old layout. If you need to make super trees from scratch, they are super easy. I need something to mount them on though. For this, I'll be using modeling clay. This is a great way to mount trees, especially if you have a bunch and you don't want to drill a bunch of holes in a wood base like I have. If it's just one or two, I would definitely consider drilling the holes though. I do this by forming the clay into a line along the edge of the module. I then put glue on it, sprinkle my scenery material on it, just like the rest of the module. Now the reason you need to do this before the clay dries is so that you can stick the trees in it. I then select trees from my recovered stock and place them in the clay. I will link where to buy these trees as well as tutorials on how I do trees in the description below and at the end. When you're doing this, fill out the tree line to your liking, and then I soak everything with IPA and scenic cement. Next, we are going to weather the track. This is done with some cheap weathering supplies from Hobby Lobby. I am using a mix of soot and rust colors. I use a stiff bristle brush to put this on. The middle of the track should be quite dark since soot, oil, and other things will collect there. Next, we have to blend our module edges together. I do this with some glue and coarse turf. The key is to make it overlap and to spread it beyond the edge right there so that it kind of fades into the rest of the scenery. This is going to make it look more natural than just a straight up line that's covering up the gap between the modules. Lastly, I put the buildings in place and we are good to go. We're down to just one module left before the entirety of phase 1 of my new layout is complete, and you're going to see that later this month. I've been without a functional layout for about a month now, and that drought is over. Today I'm showing you phase 1 of my brand new T-Trak modular model railroad, the Yadkin and Blue Ridge Railroad. I am currently building my new layout in 3 phases. Phase 1, which is right here, is Rural Hall, North Carolina, and the approaches to Elkin, North Carolina. Phase 2 will include a large module with an overpass that carries US Highway 601 over an industry, which will basically be a transload facility. a tributary crossing, a tributary that goes into the Yadkin River, the town of Elkin, and a grain silo that I'm kit bashing out of a pre-made Medusa cement plant. Phase 3 is still on the drawing board. I'm still trying to figure out how I'm going to do it, but it is going to include going into the mountains of western North Carolina. Now, as many of you know, western North Carolina has been hit hard by the flooding from Hurricane Helene. I'm going to leave a couple of links in the description below if you feel like you want to donate or figure out ways to help. Okay, let's get into phase 1. The first thing I needed to do was finish the rural hall portion of the layout. This meant I needed to do the last double shadow box module. Now, this module was very similar to my last one, so I don't think I need to do a full tutorial on it, but you can watch that last one that I'll have linked at the end of this video. Now that it's done, I can give you a complete tour. We start in Rural Hall. In the real world, Rural Hall is a small town north of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and where the Yadkin Valley Railroad branches on its two main lines. On my layout, the line is owned by the North Carolina Railroad and used by both Norfolk Southern and CSX as a joint line, in addition to the Yadkin Valley Railroad and Blue Ridge and Western Railroad using it as well. In Rural Hall, there is a transfer track where tank cars are unloaded by trucks and cars can be set out to be picked up by locals. The train then heads west into the woods of western North Carolina. Now, this is an area I grew up traveling all around. I went to college in the mountains. I also drove all over this part of the state when I worked for a local TV station. So I know places like King, Yadkinville, Wilkesboro, Elkin, and Mount Airy very well, which is something that when model railroaders build stuff, they build a lot of what they saw in their childhood and what inspired them. We pop out in an area east of Elkin, North Carolina. This place is a heavily compressed representation of a small industrial park. Here we are modeling a candle factory and a propane dealer. There's also a double cross over here that helps with switching. Lastly, we head around the hillside with a thunderstorm rolling over it. This has a layout lightning storm from Broadway Limited on it, and I built this in a tutorial that will be linked at the end of this video. Now, this module is actually going to move to be the end cap on phase 2 when things go into a U shape. Now, if you know the weather of North Carolina, a lot of storms come rolling in and start in the mountains, and that's why I'm putting that module there to represent storms coming in from the mountains. One last thing. I took the lighting kit from Diorama and put part of it as some lights in Rural Hall. I installed 2 Woodland Scenics Just Plug street lamps and a light inside one of the buildings. I put the button that came with the Diorama kit on the fascia, and now I have a night scene. Phase 1 was designed to not only be a layout I could get running fairly quickly, but also a layout that anyone can build. It is sitting on a 6-foot folding table with a black tablecloth I bought off of Amazon. I'll link that in the description. It is just another example that you do not need a ton of space or to be an expert in every single field to build a great model railroad. Now that this is done, I'll be getting to work on phase 2 of the layout, which will turn this into a U-shaped layout, including a staging yard and the town of Elkin. This is what you get when you blend two modules into a single scene. We're starting phase 2 of my new layout with this build, and we're going to be making hills with a technique that I've actually never shown on camera before. Now these are two modules from Klondike, and I'll have them linked below. They're a corner module and a T-junction module. These modules will be facing the back of my layout, but I want to do the entire layout to where it looks nice so that every module is important and looks good. I have also already glued the track in place with some super glue, so we can go ahead and get started on the scenery. To begin, we'll be using extruded foam to make our hillsides. Now, I've done this before, but I have not done a shaped hillside with a hot wire foam cutter on camera. Now, I bought this one fairly cheap, and it actually worked pretty well, so I'm going to link it in the description below. Now, before I begin, I want to address the question of fumes from the cutting. I looked into how dangerous the fumes are. I actually read a study done by a private Canadian health and safety firm on hot wire foam cutting in warehouses, and I'll link that below. But basically, make sure you're in a large, well-ventilated room. A fan to circulate the air is going to work a little bit better. They even say that the odor that comes from cutting can actually be more deceptive and seem worse than the actual exposure to any chemicals. Now, the only foam you should never cut with a hot wire is polyurethane foam. I start by drawing the shapes that I need the layers to be in. I then cut them with the hot wire foam cutter. And cut them where the seams for this module are going to be, where they break apart. Now I repeat the process until I have all of my layers for the hills. I can then glue everything down with some hot glue. I'm using hot glue because sometimes, depending on what glue you use, it can have some funny reactions to foam. Hot glue is pretty safe and it works really fast. Now that I have my layers done, I can shape these hills. I'm going to use all of the different cutting attachments for the cutter. Now these came with the cutter. One thing I also do is shape the corners and the sides of the module so that the foam doesn't interfere with adjacent modules. Well, once this is done, I can paint the module. Now, I do not tape my track when I paint because I'll be covering it with ballast and I don't care if a little bit of paint gets on it. But if you want to keep the roadbed clean, just use some painter's tape right around the edges. Now that this is done, I can begin ballasting, and I'll be using Woodland Scenic's Fine Gray Ballast. I start by applying the glue with a foam brush. I'm going to just using simple white school glue for this. I then pour my ballast and use a brush to even it out and get the exact look that I want. Now once all of that is done, I'm going to apply my scenic base, and I'm going to start with Woodland Scenic's Earth Blend. I apply school glue and then I use the cap of the shaker to apply the material. I start with a hard line at the ballast line, holding the cap facing away from the ballast so that they don't mix. Once I apply the base, I sprinkle various greens over the base. You can use greens of your choice. For this one, I'm using Woodland Scenic's Burnt Grass and Dark Green Turf. I then soak the entire scene with 90% IPA, which is isopropyl alcohol, and I use my white glue water mixture and let it soak in. The reason I do the IPA is because it breaks the surface tension and lets the glue seep into all the material and doesn't give you that hard crust at the top. While the glue is wet, I apply coarse turf so that it can dry with the scenery. I also apply some shrubbery in the form of clump foliage from Woodland Scenics as well. Next, it's time for trees. For this, I'll be using Woodland Scenic's Forest Canopy. I have two boxes of these. One is medium green and one is dark green. These use dried sedum stems with scenic turf along with some scenic cement from Woodland Scenics. I dip the sedum stems in the glue and then dip them in the scenic material. I also sprinkle the material across the bottom of the stems so that it can get a nice even coverage of leaves. And then I stick them in some white glue and stick them into the foam. I typically go from big to small, and I try to overlap the seam of the two modules with the canopy kind of overhanging so that it'll get a nice blend. The bigger trees I put more towards the center of the hillside, and the smaller trees go more towards the edges. I do mix some of the taller trees among the medium height trees as well, just to give it a little bit of variety. Now once this is done, I've actually got some clumped up gluey scenery material that is left over. And I'm going to use this to fill in the spots right at the tree line to simulate some overgrowth, just a very natural look. Next, I clean the excess scenery off of the track and do some weathering with those cheap weathering powders. And here is the final result. So the next step is to get these over to the track and get them put on the layout. So what that means is I have to take them apart. So we're just going to do this right now. Now, as you can see, we got a nice clean break, so everything went well, no crazy scenery falling or anything like that. So now we're going to be able to take this and attach it to the layout. One of the first videos I ever did on the channel 6 years ago was a grade crossing installation. I've learned a lot since then, and I've got to install one on the new layout. So let's do that today. I am setting up an automatic grade crossing using an Arduino, a DCC current sensor, and a flasher board. I will have all the parts linked in the description below. The one really cool part is the current sensor from Snowball Creek Electronics. Now, I did a video on this a while back when it first came out, and it's really cool. It's a dual zone current sensor, meaning it can detect from 2 different areas, and it automatically calculates the resting voltage of the track so that it can be more accurate in its calculation. Here is the complete parts list. For DCC current sensing, you will need to set up a detection zone. You can do this by either using an insulated track joiners or by making a small cut in the rails. Basically, you need to isolate one section of a rail, and you only have to do this for one rail in the section, not both. The rail will need its own feeder for power, and that's where the current sensing happens. When you run the feeder, you'll need to wrap it around the coil of the current sensor. Now, other current sensors, like the NCE BD20, will need you to wrap the wire a few times around the coil. The Snowball Creek detector only needs one wrap around. More wraps will not make it more accurate. Let's take a look at how the wiring is set up. Okay, for our wiring, we will be connecting to an Arduino Nano, a flasher board to control the lights, and the sensor. Each sensor has a coil and 2 outputs. We will be using one of the outputs from each sensor. First, we wrap a feeder wire from each track around the coil. We only need to do that one loop, like I said. Next, we wire up the sensor. We connect the side without the arrow to the ground and the arrow side to pin A0. We do the same for the second sensor, just connecting it to A1 instead of A0. Analog signals are a bit easier to read, and this will provide a more dramatic difference in the signal change so it isn't just hopping from 0 to 1. Next is the flasher board. Flasher boards are nice because you can control the flashing lights with a simple on or off rather than having to code the flashing pattern in. It makes coding a lot simpler and just takes that part out. This we're connecting to pin 5 for the negative and the 5-volt pin for the positive. Lastly, we need to power everything, which means we need to power the Arduino Nano and the sensor. We will be plugging in a 9-volt 1-amp power supply and then splitting it off to run the Arduino and the current sensor. And that's all the wiring for now. We're going to connect 2 LEDs to test. Now, if that was a little fast and furious, I'm going to include a wiring diagram on the GitHub page that you download this code from. But let's hop into some code itself. Okay, we are in our Arduino IDE, and we have the first section right here, which we have to declare our integers. And what we've done here is we've set sensor 1 as A0, sensor 2 is A1, crossing as pin 5, and we also have one called clear count, and we'll go over what that means in a bit. So let's go ahead and look at the setup here. This is the loop that runs once. We're going to do serial.begin. This is so we can double check and see what the sensors are putting out if we ever need to adjust it. Then we have the pin mode. We're declaring that the digital pin 5 is an output for crossing. So digital pin 5 equals crossing, which is an output. Next up, we need to enumerate the crossing states, which is what we're calling it, crossing state. We have clear, occupied, and clearing. And we're also going to say that the starting state is clear right there. Next up, let's take a look at the loop, and we have where we're going to read our sensors. So we're going to declare 2 new integers, sensor 1 read and sensor 2 read, and we say that those are analog read of sensor 1 and sensor 2. Next up, we have our print lines for the serial print so that we can see what our things are, and that is track 1, sensor 1 read is going to show, track 2, sensor 2 read is going to show, and then we also want to see our clear count for when we're using that, and then we put a delay of 500, which basically means it's going to take a reading every half a second, with Arduino time being in milliseconds. Next up, let's go down to our switch. So we have crossing state, and we need to say case st_clear, which is our crossing clear state. We're going to call that crossing clear, and then that's going to be going from sensor 1 read and sensor 2 read. Then we'll break. Now we have case st_occupied, so that's going to be crossing occupied, sensor 1 read, sensor 2 read, break. And then we're going to have case st_clearing, which is going to be crossing clearing, sensor 1 read, sensor 2 read, break. Okay, so we're going to get into our different states. We're going to start off with the clear state where nothing is being picked up by the sensor. And we're going to say that right here. We're going to say if sensor 1 read equals 0 or is greater than 0 and sensor 2 read is greater than 0, then digital write crossing high. Now what that means is basically when this sensor picks up something, it's going to send back a negative. So it's going to cut everything off and you're going to get a 0 value. So if the value you get back from it is greater than 0, it's going to be saying that it doesn't have anything showing up. So if it reads something greater than 0, it's not picking up something. And also, the way that we have the flasher board wired up is that basically because we're sending it power versus connecting it to ground, we're going to put it as high is going to make it off. And when we click it to low, that's going to make it turn on. So the crossing high means that the flasher board is off. And then at the end, we're also going to reset the clear count to 0. That's going to come from the end, and that's going to make sense at the end. Now, if we come here and we do if sensor 1 read equals 0 and sensor 2 read equals 0, we're going to see that it says crossing state equals st_occupied. So we're going to move to our occupied state, which we're going to next. Okay, here's our occupied state. This one's really simple. It has the sensor 1 read and the sensor 2 read, and it has digital write crossing low. So when you're in that state, the crossing is on. Remember, the high is off, so low is on. That flasher board is going. That's working those signals. Now, if sensor 1 reads greater than 0 again, and sensor 2 reads greater than 0 again, we're going to step into crossing state clearing. Now this is a special kind of a checker to make sure that we're not getting a false clear sensor signal from the sensor. So what we're going to do here is we step into our crossing clearing state right here. And that's going to still be operating the flasher board, digital write, crossing low. And then we're going to do something a little different here. So you can see where it says if sensor 1 read is greater than 0 and sensor 2 read is greater than 0 and clear count is less than 5, we're going to have this clear count plus plus, which means it's going to add 1 to the clear count. And then we have a delay of 1,000. So what that means is basically every second up to 5 seconds, it's going to add and it's going to count up to 5 that it's clear. And if it makes it to 5, which we'll have down here, it's going to turn off the signal. So now we have if sensor 1 read equals 0 or, which is what these two bars are, sensor 2 read equals 0 and clear count is less than 5. We reset the clear count to 0 and it goes right back up to here. Finally, if we have sensor 1 read is greater than 0 and sensor 2 read is greater than 0 and clear count is greater than 4, you can do greater than or equal to 5, but I like greater than 4. Crossing state equals st clear, which sends us all the way back up to the crossing clear right here. And you can see that we reset the clear count with that one right there. So that is all of the code right there. It works very well. Let's go ahead and see how it works. Okay, we're going to test and see if this works before we put it in on the layout. I have a 10K resistor that I can complete the circuit on the track without short-circuiting the DCC system. And there we go. Lastly, we need to install our signals. Now, I have these cantilever signals that I got off eBay. I'll link those in the description below. First, I drill the holes to install the signals, and it took me a couple times to get the right spot. I then thread them through and put the nut that came with them onto the bottom side so that it screws in tight and we have a nice threaded connection that's mounted to it. Now, these did come with some resistors, but since I'm powering these with 5 volts, I'm not going to worry about using those resistors. I then connect all of the signals up. Now, I'm using some terminal strips for this. Please note that your positives, which are the red wires from the signals, all need to share the same connection, and then each of the black negative connections needs to be connected in pairs, one from each signal, and this allows for that flashing effect. Okay, let's run a train over this module. We now have a solid grade crossing signal. Now, I personally cannot wait to detail this entire module. It's going to have a lot of buildings that need to be built and things like that, and I'll be doing that over the next few months. One thing I plan to eventually do is install an accessory power tap from Snowball Creek. They're about $5 to $8. They're pretty good. And what this will let me do is power the Arduino and the current sensor from track power, which means I don't have to run a separate wire to plug in the power for that. Right now, I'm okay with that, but it's not going to be a permanent thing. Something's a bit different. Oh yeah, new backdrop. But this is no ordinary backdrop. This one hides something. Today I'm going to show you how I made this backdrop that hides the return to my staging track and makes it appear that there is a single track on the module behind me. Let's get into it. For this video, you're going to need 2 sheets of black foam core, a hobby knife, some scissors, and a backdrop of your choice along with some glue. I am going to be adding a photo backdrop to mine from Train Junkies. Now, Train Junkies makes model railroad photo backdrops from Z all the way to G scale. These highly detailed and highly accurate photo backdrops can make your layout look amazing. I can tell you that they have fantastic customer service. I ordered the first version of this backdrop and it actually got completely lost in the mail. It is completely gone, no idea where it is. I hit them up and they just sent me another one, which was amazing. So trainjockeys.com or check them out on eBay. First, I need to get the right size for the backdrop. Now for this, I'm actually going to put it in between 2 tracks on this middle module right behind me. So I need it to be thin and stable, and that's why I use the black foam core, and I put them two together to get my measurements, and I cut their length to size and taped them together using painter's tape, just like I did this backdrop over here behind the feed mill. Next, I need to cut their height to size. I roll the backdrop across the foam core. Now, because I have a sky backdrop already behind me, I'm going to cut along the tree line and make this a trees-only backdrop that kind of mimics a hillside in the backdrop, which you can see right here. This will be blocking the review of my return to staging track that goes along the back of the layout. I need to hold it in place while I cut, but I made a bit of a boo-boo doing this. I thought some sensitive surface painter's tape would hold it down and be easy to remove once I was done doing my cut. Well, I was wrong on that. So don't make my mistake. Use spring clamps or something similar to hold your photo backdrop down if you want to do this cut like this. I ended up ripping some of the photo part of the backdrop off, and don't worry, I figured out a workaround. Obviously, I still have it right here, so we are good to go, but I would advise against using any sort of even super sensitive painter's tape to just hold it down. I just use a little bit, thank goodness, but yeah. Now I can attach the backdrop. To glue the backdrop down, I'm going to apply a bunch of white glue here, and then I'm going to use a paint spreader to create a uniform flat covered surface. Now you can use a scraper, anything pretty much with a flat surface that's going to be able to push it down nice and flat. And this is going to minimize the wrinkles from the gluing process. Anyone who's tried to just spread glue across a surface and then roll something on it knows the wrinkles and the bubbles that I'm talking about. This will minimize that. I then lay the backdrop across. Now the backdrop came in a roll, which means I need to hold it in place as it dries so that it doesn't go flying up. So I grab anything I can and weigh it down, literally just throwing everything on there. Now once it is dry, I can attach the backdrop to the module. So here's the trick to attaching this. I do not need this to be fully permanent. If I need to move the module, then I'll need to remove that backdrop. So I'm going to use hot glue to install it. And I start by cutting 4 of these little L brackets that I have out of leftover foam core. And I eyeball the measurements to make sure that the train could run under them and go through them kind of like a tunnel. I then glue them in place to the backdrop and to the module base using a hot glue gun. Once this was done, I did some test running of trains to figure out exactly where I needed to adjust. There was a little bit of rubbing. I do recommend getting your longest, most least clearance cars and locomotives going on this, and make sure that you are getting them at speed, slow, all this kind of stuff when you're testing this, just to make sure that they don't run into things. All right, I've got a good looking backdrop here, and so I took the remainder and attached it behind the layout right over there, and just to help blend it in, you can see it kind of makes a nice backdrop, a nice smooth scene right there. The only issue that I have is that the edge is pretty obvious right over here, and I do not expect it to be perfect, but I do want it to look better and a bit more blended, so I do need to blend it in. I start with a few pre-made trees from JT Scenery. You can use Woodland Scenics or whatever your preference is, and I glue those in place on their bases, and then I use some coarse turf to blend them into the scenery that I have already done. Now I then use some clump foliage from Woodland Scenics to blend the rest of it in, and this includes hiding the edge at the base of the backdrop, and this just does just enough to hide it and keep that papery look away and just let you have a quick look and it's going to look okay. The last thing I do is take a black permanent marker and just barely color in some of the white frayed edges on the backdrop I have from cutting it, and this actually worked out pretty great. It just needs to take some of the highlights and the contrast away so that it's not as noticeable. And here is the final result. In all of my layout builds, I've never done a water feature. Well, today, that changes. My layout is a T-Trak layout, and there are variants of T-Trak modules called bridge modules, and these are either singles or doubles that you can buy commercially that are designed to go with the Kato Unitrack bridge system, and there are several different lengths of bridges, but the one I'm going to be using today is a single module with a 3/4 straight bridge, and it's going to make a very nice looking tributary into a river. So let's go ahead and hop right into this. To do this, you're going to need a special kind of T-Trak module. This is a single bridge module. It has a span that is the same length as a 3/4 straight, the 186mm straight in Kato Unitrack, and this is from Klondike's. And what we're doing here is we're going to take Sculptamold and slope our little creek bed that we're going to have under this. Now, Sculptamold is my personal favorite for this. It can be a little dense and heavy, so the maximum you want to put on here is probably not too much, but this will be just fine. And we're just going to sculpt out everything. We're putting it under the bridge. Some people may put in the bridge afterwards because you do get some working time on this, but this is a great and easy way to form that riverbed, and then it takes about a day to dry. Now, once that is dry, you can actually see that I've reattached this to my layout. I just like working on it this way. But I'm going to go ahead and coat everything with that brown acrylic paint. Now, you can also mix in brown acrylic paint with the Sculptamold to get a brown color, but I just want to do this afterwards because I have a mix of Sculptamold and non-Sculptamold section. This will get everything the same color. Now, do make sure that you get up under that bridge and get as much painted as possible, just so that you don't have any little white spots showing, because they are very obvious when they show. The last thing I did was a little bit of dry brushing, and of course my camera chose not to focus right now, but dry brushing is basically where you brush off, I'd say like 90% of the paint that's on your brush, and that just allows you to do these little like barely streaks and things like that, and it gives you a really good look for weathering it just like this. So you can be pretty liberal with the brush and it's fairly forgiving, but this is how I weather with dry brushing, is I just do a little bit right there. Next up, it's time to do some ballasting, and I start by putting a little bit of glue on the sides of the Unitrack, and then I'm going to sprinkle some of my Woodland Scenics fine gray ballast on there, just enough to really get to where I can sweep it in, and then I'll bring in a nice brush and I will brush everything back onto it and just make sure that I get my line all nice and neat. Now, I will glue this down permanently in just a minute, but I'm going to do all of that when I do all of my scenery. So I kind of do that all at once. But the main thing you want to do here is just make sure that you get it all nice and neat, and then you also just brush the excess off the tops of those ties. And then I'm just going to repeat the process on the other side. This module didn't require much ballasting at all. Now, funny story, I went to edit this and I sat down after getting this, and the clip that had me putting the glue on the module and the scenery, the blended turf, the earth blend, it was corrupted. So we're going to skip ahead. Just know that I coated everything in a scenic glue. That's important. And then I started sprinkling that earth blend scenic turf on it. And then for the riverbed, I went a little bit darker, had some Woodland Scenics dirt turf, and basically it's a dark brown, more of a monotone color. And so I went in there and I basically just covered everything up. And once I had that complete, I went back with the blended turf and hit the edges just so I could have a nice hard edge. Kind of that point when you're walking towards a creek where the vegetation sometimes just stops and you get into the muddy area. If you've ever been around those creeks, especially with like Georgia clay and things like that, that kind of space right there. Once that was done, I coated everything with 90% isopropyl alcohol using the Mister bottle, and then I completely soaked everything in a scenic glue. Now that is very, very specific to that. I'm not talking about my usual white glue water mixture. I'm talking about a scenic glue. Now the reason for this is because of the product we're going to be using to do the water. Now this stuff, it's stuff you can buy from Woodland Scenics, and basically it's going to work better with the substance we're going to be using for the water, the realistic water. So that's why you got to use this, especially if you're wanting clear water. The regular PVA based stuff can really cause cloudy water in a way that's not great. So make sure you're using a scenic glue for this part at least. Now after that was all said and done, I came in with some more Woodland Scenics dirt and sprinkled it on top just to kind of get a more solid, kind of like a sediment base for the creek. And then I came in with some tan fine ballast or gravel, depending on what you want to use, and then I sprinkled it on there. And then I came in with a little bit of small talus, which are like small rocks, and then put those all in there. And I was able to get a nice uneven rocky sedimenty bed that's going to go underneath the creek bed, which if you can see it through it all, which I'm going for a very murky water, so you may not, but if you can see through it at all, you'll be able to see that riverbed. Now once that is all done, we're going to let it soak and dry in scenic glue and IPA again, and then we need to seal off the spot where the water is going to be. So I'm going to use hot glue to do that. So I'm going to take some hot glue and go around the edges right here where we're going to glue a piece of little bit of plastic that's going to go on there. I will link some of that in the description below. I just cut it with some scissors and then pressed it against the hot glue and then went and put in some more hot glue to seal it off. Now I do plan on painting this down the road, so it's not going to look like that all the time, but this is going to give it a good seal so that it doesn't leak out, or at least it hopefully will not leak out once I do the pour, and then we should be good to go once it dries. Now we can do the scenery for the module. Now we're going for this look right here. So I start off with some coarse turf and just glue that in place. And I'm very careful not to have too much of that glue try to seep down to the bottom. And then I'm going to go ahead and go in and put in these clumps of turf right here that you can just really pretty much put in whatever you want. I'll link some of these products in the description below, but go ahead and get those soaked in as much as possible. And notice I'm having them like at a defined line that the vegetation doesn't go below. And then I come in and I fill in the rest of it with some clump foliage just to give it that very uneven, unkempt, brushy feel. And then the last thing I'm going to do is probably come in with a few of these trees that I had left over, these super trees, and then I'm going to put those in as well. These trees were left over from my previous layout, and I've done several videos on how to do them. I'm going to link that at the end of this video. But basically, I'm just taking leftovers from that and just kind of sticking them everywhere, again, to kind of get that unkempt, hasn't been walked through much, very thick vegetation look. And here is what it looks like just before we're going to do the pour. Now to do the pour, I'm going to be using Woodland Scenics Realistic Water. Now there's a few caveats with this. Typically when you pour one of these layers, you don't want it to be more than 1/8 of an inch thick. You also don't want to shake the bottle because the bubbles are going to make it very difficult to get a good pour. And for coloring, you can use things like Woodland Scenics different colors for their specific water. Like I'm using the murky color for this, and what you do basically is you pour it in a cup together and you use whatever your instructed amount of drops are for your measurement is, and you get that murky look going in just by mixing those together. And then you pour it, and you want to pour them typically in layers of 1/8 of an inch, and I actually did about double that for the first layer. I did about 1/4 of an inch, and it took about twice as long to dry. 1/8 of an inch takes about 24 hours to dry. 1/4 inch took about 2.5 days to dry. Now you're probably going to get some bubbles with your pour, and of course you can try and poke them and get them away, but the most effective method is something that's actually not recommended by the manufacturer, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you, don't try this at home unless you are confident, and kids, don't do this without an adult. I am going to use a little bit of fire. Now what I mean is that the Realistic Water specifically says do not use heat with this product, but in my experience this worked in very brief bursts, but you do have to be very careful because not only can you mess up the Realistic Water, but you could light your scenery on fire, kind of like I did for a second. But this is seriously the best way I've come with getting bubbles out of things like this. And I just had to show you guys, but just be very, very careful. Now you get to the point where it has dried over a couple days and you look at it and you're like, it looks
okay, but not the best. Well, that's when you have to do multiple pours. I ended up having to do 3 different layers of pours on this particular module. Basically, you're just going to where you think it looks right. Alright, so after my 3rd pour, I was really where I wanted to be with this. And the only thing I wanted was a few little eddies and things like that. Now, Woodland Scenics makes a product for that called Water Ripples. It's like between $15 and $20 a jar. And if you have a lot of these to make, it's a great idea. But I only had a few that I wanted to make. And so I wanted to show you guys this technique for doing this right when the stuff gets tacky and it's not quite dry. You can just take a paintbrush right where you want to do these little eddies and water ripples and things like that. Like, I just want these little trails behind stuff that's like in the water that it may be flowing around, and I'm just going to grab paintbrushes and just tap them and smooth it out. You want to do it very gently and when this is very tacky, but it works great and gives you a nice result, especially when you only want a few of these.
And here is the final result.
You know, it's about time that I scenic another module. Let's get to it. This module has a lot to represent. It's going to be representative of the entire area east of Elkin, North Carolina. There is a large field and several industries with a large wooded area as well. Now, to do this, we're going to be using a model railroad design principle called selective compression. This is where you pick the aspects that are most important to you about a scene that may be too large for a space, and you may use smaller buildings, less track, or a combination of multiple techniques, but basically you shrink a space that would normally be too large for your model railroad to be represented in the space that you have. And this is something that is very, very, very common in model railroading because most of us don't have the space to accurately model the scope of a railroad. So let's get started. Now, to begin, I've already painted the base, ballasted the track, and attached the backdrop. Now, if you want to see me do some of those things in the past, I'm going to link all of those videos at the end of this video so that you can check those out. Now, I also used my technique for asphalt, a thin layer of styrene, 2 colors of spray paint, and this styrene is actually a for sale sign. I cut it, spray it, and then glue it in place. Very, very simple. Now the backdrop, first of all, you may notice it's a little bit smaller than when I originally installed it. I was having some rubbing issues with some trains going behind it, so I shrank it down so I could bring it a little bit further out, and that fixed everything. But it is also a bit abrupt and pretty close to the track, so we're going to blend it in with some trees and shrubbery. And now I'm going to be using a mix of super trees that I actually saved from my last layout, pre-made trees that I bought, and some clump foliage. Now, I start with some modeling clay, and I love using this to act as the base for trees on hard surfaces. It keeps me from having to drill a ton of holes, and you can get modeling clay in a color that's going to be fairly natural looking, like this terracotta color. This is Crayola modeling clay. Then I began just sticking trees in it, and I blended in with some excess shrubbery, some broken branches off the super trees, as well as some coarse turf. Now I can do the scenic base for the rest of the module. I use Woodland Scenic's Earth Blend. I then mix various turfs over it, including some medium greens, some darker greens, and things like that. Now, there are parts of the backdrop that are too close to the track to use trees, so there I just use clump foliage and coarse turf to blend the edge of the backdrop to the module. It isn't perfect, and you can still clearly tell that there is a backdrop, but it's going to make it look a little bit less abrupt. I then coat everything with a 90% IPA and scenic glue to go ahead and get everything soaked in and glued on. Now, the reason that you use IPA is because it breaks the surface tension and allows the glue to seep into every part. Now, you'll notice that I have left an area blank with just the Earth Blend turf. This area will be my low growth farm field that's kind of out there next to these industries, just a small representation. I'm choosing to selectively compress this farm field just to the edge over here. Now, once the glue has dried on the scenic base, I draw lines of white glue with a glue bottle and place dark coarse turf on the glue lines to represent crop rows. Now, once that is done, I add a few more trees and blend them with some coarse turf. I then place my structures and soak everything with IPA and scenic glue, and I let it dry. And here's the result.
Now, you guys know that I love a good model railroad Arduino project, but today I'm throwing all of that out the window. We're going analog and controlling turnouts with these. This is a double pole, double throw switch. Now, what does that mean? It means that the switch controls two separate circuits simultaneously. When you open these up, you'll see 6 contacts isolated in 2 rows of 3, a rocker arm on each row, and this rocker arm lets you touch 2 of the contacts at the same time, completing the circuit. Now, it has 3 different positions, and the middle position does not complete the circuit, so this is known as an on-off-on switch. These have many uses in model railroading. They can switch 2-aspect signals, turn on track power, even reverse polarity of a reversing loop of track. Today, though, we're going to use them to activate specifically Kato turnouts, though this will also work on tortoise switch machines. Snap switches require a bit of different wiring, but you can use these for them. Here's a complete list of the supplies you will need.
We're going to be doing two different types of switches, a single turnout and an interlocking set of turnouts. In order to make this work, we'll need to do some wiring. This is why I like these switches particularly. They have screw terminals. Now, you first connect the power to one side of the switch. Then you make an X with your wiring connecting one terminal with the one diagonal from it on the other side. And then do the same for the opposite terminal. Then you'll need to connect the wires from the turnout motor to the two center terminals. In the end, it looks like this. So this is how you wire up a double pole, double throw switch, and the wiring is the same for the two different types of turnout arrangements we are doing, but not the switches. One will be a momentary switch like this one. This is excellent for controlling individual turnouts and is denoted by its on, off, on with those parentheses around the on if you're looking for them. The other will be a regular switch denoted as on, off, on without the parentheses. This will stay in the position that it is thrown and not have that little jump back, that spring back. To be clear, both of these will work for either turnout arrangement. But since you only need a brief burst of power, the regular switch is a bit more cumbersome to operate for the single turnout versus the momentary switch. Now, let's start with the single turnout arrangement. All I need to do is wire some power up to it. I do this using a barrel plug adapter, and I'm using a 12 volt 1 amp power supply, though I have done this with 9 volt power supplies as well. Now, let's see if it works. For the record, this is a temporary setup. Don't judge me on the tape. So that was pretty simple, but what if you want turnouts to all line up in one simple move? This is known as interlocking. This is where you have all the turnouts line up in a certain way for a train to be routed a certain way. Now we're going to wire up these two turnouts to be interlocking. For this, we'll be using two of the regular switches. I intend to wire them up just like the other switch, but instead of going straight to power, I'm going to put a momentary push button in the power feed. This means that the power will be off unless I push that button. I can set the alignment of the turnouts, then when I'm ready, I push the button and the turnouts will align properly. I'm still able to control the turnouts individually, as well as putting the switches in the off position or operating them manually. For this, I'm wanting the turnout of the siding to align straight whenever the main line turnout aligns diverging. I flip the switches and then I push the buttons and bam! We've got interlocking turnouts. I can still control them individually, but they can be linked together as well, and I'm able to set them whichever way I want. All that's left to do is install the switches on the front of the module, and we are ready to go. A few episodes ago, you saw me create 3D printed highway bridge sections to model Interstate 77 on my layout. Well, today we are integrating all of that with this module and creating a scene. We're going to be using a mix of products from Woodland Scenics and JTT Scenery. One of the products you've never seen me use before is Woodland Scenics Fine Leaf Foliage, and this is actually a pretty cool product, and I'll show you why in a bit. But first, we need to paint the base of the module. Now, the tracks have already been attached for a while, but we're going to go ahead and paint it with some brown acrylic paint.
Next, we need to do the ballasting of the Kato Unitrack. Now we do this using Woodland Scenic's fine gray ballast in the medium gray color. We start by putting a line of white glue on each side of the track, and this is just to hold the base of the ballast in place. Next, we sprinkle the ballast. I like to put the ballast in a cap of a shaker, but you can use a spoon or whatever you like. And you're just putting this in place. Don't worry much about the neatness just yet. I do try to keep it away from the center of the rails, but overall, just trying to get it on there and onto the glue. Next, we come in with a flat edge brush and brush the excess ballast all around and get it spread out pretty evenly. Now, some of the techniques that I use to get this right, I'll do a kind of tapping and I'll do a little bit of stippling on the tops that lets you get the ballast into pretty much everywhere, because it'll work the ballast in between the ties, and you want to get that kind of clear so that it looks more realistic. So that little tapping and that little stippling, that's going to let you be able to see the ties better and get everything settled in between them. Now once this is done, I can spray the entire thing with 90% isopropyl alcohol and then soak it with my white glue water mixture. Now I've actually changed my mixture, and it's now slightly between 30 and 35% white glue, with the rest being water, and then I add a few drops of dish soap in to help it flow evenly. Now this also helps when you're going to ballast with the alcohol, because if it's not soaked in all the way, the dish soap is actually going to help it go through and break that surface tension and lets the glue seep into all of the ballast, which is actually the purpose of the alcohol as well. Once I get to a certain point of dryness, I can start working on the scenery. Now this is a T-junction module, so it really has three distinct sections, and the one section that's all the way on the right is the one that's going to have the interstate bridge. So we're going to do that one last. We're going to start with the one that blends with the creek module that I built a little while back. I'll link that at the end of this video. Now the first thing we need to do is put our scenic base in. I do have a little thing that I need to do. I need to add a little section of extra backdrop that I had from putting everything else in. And what I basically do is I have this cutout section and I put a little bit of black foam core behind it and arrange it in a way that's going to stand upright. And the first thing I do is I just set it in place, and then I score a mark with a utility knife to exactly where I'm going to need it. And then I'm going to put my glue in place and do all of my scenic material around that, making sure that I avoid that area. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to clear out that area, and then I'm going to attach that scenic backdrop that's kind of the blend in right there with some tacky glue, which is another one of my favorite things that you don't see me use that often, but when I do, I'll use tacky glue for that. So that is how I got that in. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come in with some coarse turf, and I'm going to sprinkle that on there as well. And then I also have some underbrush from JTT Scenery. This stuff basically comes in kind of like almost like a sheet, and you basically pull it apart and it's bushes and everything, and it can really just kind of fit everywhere. It's a really cool little underbrush type product and looks really good and can do one of those things that can really make your layout pop if you put it in there right. Now I'm going to be using this to make the overgrowth that blends the two modules together. And then I'm going to just go ahead and glue those down like normal. Now after that, we're going to break out the Woodland Scenics fine leaf foliage, and you can see now what I'm going to be talking about. This is basically very similar to super trees, but it's pre-made. Now it's not the cheapest stuff in the world, but if you're looking to have pre-made super trees or things like that, it's pretty much the go-to product, especially in N-scale. It's going to work really well. In HO scale, it's going to work for smaller trees. Now what I did here is I took some little blobs of modeling clay, some of the terracotta Crayola modeling clay, and I made little tree stands for this so that I could sit them up. I also stuck them into some of those underbrush clusters and glued them in place and let them sit, and then I put some coarse turf and stuff over them, and they should be good to go. And I also did add some various coarse turfs and clump foliage and things like that just to kind of blend it out. And I soaked everything with IPA and also the glue mixture. Next, we can start on the middle of the T-junction module, and that's actually, we're gonna make a little lump hill out of some modeling clay. And you've seen me do this before. It's a great little technique for this because A, it is really easy to shape exactly the way you want, and B, it lets you just pretty much just stick trees in it, which is awesome, and white glue sticks to it just fine. So we're gonna go ahead and mold that out, and then we're going to cover the whole thing in white glue, and then we're gonna do our scenic base, kind of a rinse and repeat of the first process, and we just cover everything up with the brown, then the blended green, and then the dark green, and then we put coarse turf. Now for the trees, we're gonna do something a little different. Now you've seen me do this plenty of times before, but I'm gonna be using Woodland Scenics Forest Canopy, and I'm gonna be using the medium green. And this basically uses sedum stems and coarse turf with some scenic cement. And you put the scenic cement into a bowl, and then you take the tops of the sedum stems and you dip it in there and get some glue in there. And then you can put it in the coarse turf and it's gonna stick, and then voila, you've got a really good looking treetop. These don't work well as hero trees, but they do work great when they put together to make a canopy or a wooded section. They look pretty good. You may have to trim off some of the bottoms there, but overall they look good. And this is just another rinse and repeat process. I then take some more of the JTT scenery underbrush and then use some Woodland Scenics clump foliage and place it around the area, and then I soak everything with IPA and my glue mix and let it dry. Now for the section with the interstate bridges. Now I 3D printed these actually a little bit different, and I modified them using my 3D printer to add basically a lane line in them. Now my 3D printer is a Bamboo Lab X1 Carbon. A lot of printers have multi-material units where you can have multiple filaments in them. So I had a gray and a white, and I used that just to do a 1/10 of a millimeter high white line for the lane lines on there, and that was pretty easy, pretty simple to do. But for each software it's going to be different, so I can't really say exactly how to do it, but I did it with the Bamboo Lab software. I printed this thing out and I assembled it using a mix of plastic cement for the printed parts, the filament printed parts. It actually worked pretty well. And then I used super glue for the resin printed parts. Again, if you want to watch that video, I'm going to link it at the end and you can check that out. But once I have it printed and assemble, and it's going to look like this, and I go ahead and put it down and mark my module. Just using a utility knife, I do a little bit of scoring and basically where I want to put supports, and I want to put the scenic material on it. Next, we're going to apply white glue everywhere except for the area where I want the supports to go. I want those to touch bare because I'm going to come in and scenic around those after the fact. Now that I have this done and we can clearly see where the supports are going to go, I can go ahead and scenic this area and just leave those areas blank. And I want this to look very overgrown because in the real world, I do have a reference for this. It's very overgrown because it's heading down to a slow flowing riverbank. So it's very, very lush. It's got lots of vegetation. So we're basically just throw a mix of everything we've used before, and then we're going to do that. So there's going to be some fine leaf foliage. There's going to be, of course, all my scenic base material. There's going to be clump foliage. There's going to be coarse turf. Everything is in there. I mean, literally everything is in there. And basically, I'm just kind of feeling out the way that it's going to be. My basic way of doing this is basically I kind of like made stuff taller as it went away from the middle of the bridge because it's going to be getting hit by a little bit more sunlight. So it's going to be a little bit shorter and heading towards the ground in kind of like an angle or kind of a bowl shape. Just my way of doing it. You can't actually see a bowl, but that's kind of how I did it, to where like the shorter stuff that's going to be growing along the ground, that's going to be able to pull sun and stuff from other places. That's what I basically did there, and put that in the middle, and then more of the taller stuff was off to the sides. Next, we're going to glue our bridges in place. So I bring them in and I make sure that everything fits right, and then I use tacky glue, which is really good. I want these things to really be able to hold, but I also want the potential of removing them later, so I'm not going to use anything like super glue. And I glue those in place and then use some coarse turf just to sprinkle around there to make it look like the vegetation's kind of growing there and that the ground isn't perfectly flat and you don't know exactly where the ground is there. So that's what I did there, and then I brought in the second smaller bridge, which is the weird thing about this section of interstate, is that the bridges are two different sizes. And I do the same thing, and I bring them and make sure the vegetation's creeping up just a little bit, but not too high. The last thing that we need to do is just a little bit of weathering of the bridge. Now, I don't have the vehicles that I want to put on there just yet, but we can go ahead and do some weathering. I can use these temporary cheapo vehicles that I got off Amazon, but it's going to make it look a bit more realistic, a little bit of tire wear and things like that, plus a little bit of streaking down the supports. It's going to make this just sell it all that a little bit more. And here is the final scene. It's the home stretch of my layout build. We've got just 2 modules to go. Let's get this thing done. The last module I made, I 3D printed a highway bridge using my Bamboo Lab X1 Carbon and its multi-material unit. Well, these type of devices have actually become more available and more affordable. And I thought to myself, could I print a fully painted surface street with this? Well, let's warm up the 3D printer and see what we can do. Here we go.
Now the first thing we need to do is prep the module, and what I'm going to do here is I clean it off and then just give it its brown base coat. This is so if there's any gaps in the scenic base or anything like that, it's a bit better disguised, and this is something that I typically do.
Now that the module is prepped, I need to design my road.
I designed these road sections in Tinkercad. Now this is a pretty complicated tutorial and be a lot to go in and would be a video on its own. I am working on that Tinkercad guide, so be on the lookout for that. And what I have here is basically I took the designs, I put them on the road, and I made them 1/10 of a millimeter higher than the road surface. I then took them into my Bamboo Lab print slicer, and I was able to color them using the Bamboo Lab software. Depending on what printer you use, you're going to be using different software, and then I printed them out. Now that I have all the road pieces, I can attach them, and I'm going to be using tacky glue to put these things in place. So I start off by putting these little risers that I printed off that give me the correct angle that I want, and I did those doing a little bit of finagling in Tinkercad. So I get those pushed in there, and then I glue the road surface on top. This way I could print it out nice and evenly and flat. I did try to print it out all at once, but it made the designs look a little weird, so that's why I have the risers in place. Now I need to put down the first flat section of road, so I put a little bit of tacky glue down, but then I'm also going to need to get these to attach to the part of the road that's coming down from the crossing. So I use a little bit of a plastic cement, and that's going to basically do a little bit of dissolving and do a little bit of plastic welding. With the PLA, I was able to do this with the bridge, and so it let me know that it was going to work, and it actually started working a little better when I did this. So go ahead and get those attached, and then it's just a rinse and repeat process for attaching the other pieces. The last thing I have to attach is this base for the buildings that includes the sidewalk and the rounded edges. And again, I'm just using tacky glue. I'm not going to attach this to the rest of the road with the plastic cement, but we're just going to go ahead and get that in place, push it in place, and let it dry. And then we have one last little sidewalk to put in over here as well.
Next, we need some buildings, so might as well print those too. I'm going to warm up my Elegoo Mars 5.
Now these buildings are actually Patreon models of the month from the last couple months. They are what are called Merchants Row buildings. They're designed to stick together really close, and this is buildings number 1 and 2. I'm printing off 2 number 1s and 1 number 2. That sounds a little confusing, but we're going to go ahead and get these printing in the printer and get them cleaned up. Now that the models are all cleaned up, I can go ahead and get them painted. Now I use spray paint for these models, works really well. Now what I'm using here is a little bit of Rust-Oleum's Matte Paprika. I find this to be a really good brick color once it dries, and you can see me just doing little puffs, and what that basically is just making sure that I don't overwhelm the details with paint layers, because the details are quite small. And I just have a spare cardboard box that I had, and I'm just doing a little bit of spray painting and turning the whole thing. Now this is also because I'm spray painting outside and there's a little bit of wind, so I want to make sure that I'm hitting the same angle and don't have this paint blowing everywhere. Now next up, I'm going to be masking off the areas that I want to be gray. So I take some painter's tape and I mask off all of the areas that I need to be gray, and then cover up the rest of the model so that none of the gray leaks out on anywhere. And then I just cut any of the spaces that I need to using a little box cutter knife, and that's going to get us our nice clean lines. And I remove the tape, and then I can do the painting. Now the way that I do the painting with this is I'm actually going to paint it again with that paprika red color, and what that's going to do is it's basically going to fill in all the little imperfections in the seal that the tape has. And then I come back and I paint the gray over it once that has completely dried. So that's why you saw that the tape was red. I just forgot to hit record because I'm not a smart guy, but then I'm just going to go ahead and paint everything just by twisting it around and let it dry.
Now we need to put down our scenery material.
We're going to start off with the ballast, of course. I always do ballast before I put down any of the turf for scenery, and I start off by putting a line of glue on the T-Trak so that I can get something to hold the ballast as I am shaping it. Then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to be putting on the ballast, and I use the cup of the ballast cup. This is Woodland Scenic's fine medium grade ballast, and I just spread it out roughly where it needs to go. You don't need to get it exact right here, and then you're going to go ahead and just use a brush or something like that to kind of shape it the exact way you want. And then once you're done with that, you'll go ahead and soak it with IPA to break the surface tension, and then you'll bring in your white glue water mixture, which I've actually changed mine a little bit to about 30% white glue, and then the rest is water. And then I put a couple drops of dish soap in it just to get it a little bit more flowing, and it works really well. So once you've got that done, then you can just let that dry, and then we can move on to the other scenic materials. Now for the scenery itself, we're going to go ahead and put down some white glue. We're going to spread it out with a brush. You want to get any drops like that off of the road, like right there. You can just get them off with your fingers, nothing crazy. But go ahead and spread that around so something has something to adhere to. I won't get it too close to the ballast, but I will get it very close to the road, just enough, because this isn't going to be the only glue that holds down that scenery. Once the glue is down, I can put down the very base material, which is that Woodland Scenics blended turf, kind of an earth blend, and that basically works as the dirt or the soil that's going to be under the materials. The thing I always tell people when they're doing this is you don't want it to be all one color. Nature isn't all one color, so giving a mix of browns and different shades of greens is going to give you the most realistic result. Now for this area back here, we're going to do something a little bit different. Now this is an area where vehicles need to access. They're going to come off the road right there. They're going to come to the back of the buildings for deliveries. They may be pulling up for something that's on the spur right there. So we're actually going to be using Woodland Scenic's gravel. And this is a cool product. It's a very fine mixed color fine gravel, and so we're going to spread that in, and you want to make sure that your ballast is dry before you do this so you can brush off any of the excess. But go ahead and get that in there, and it's okay if it mixes in a little bit. It's going to look more natural that way, but we're going to go ahead and get it all spread around here nice and evenly to kind of even out where the road is. This is also a great material to put on the shoulders of the road to illustrate kind of a soft shoulder of the road. Now we're going to be going through and doing just the rest of the scenery, adding some more of that scenic base, and then we'll come back with some greens and put them in places that we need them to. I'm actually going to sprinkle a tiny bit of green on the gravel when I do it, but we'll get everything in place, and then we're going to go right back, soak it with IPA and then that white glue water mixture and let it dry. Now, once all that is dried, we can come in and do some weathering, and I've got my weathering powders right here, and we're going to start with the tracks. And what I do is I basically come in with some dark color, some blacks and browns, and I'm going to weather those tracks because a lot of times you're going to have stuff dripping off the trains, whether it's grease, oil, brake dust, anything like that. That's going to be dripping off of the trains right here, and it's going to collect in the middle. If you've ever looked at real tracks, you'll notice it's kind of dark in the middle over the ties, and it may be more of a monotone color than just simply having the track with ballast all around it. So you want to just kind of brush this everywhere and get those tracks nice and dirty. And you will need to come back and clean the tops of the rails after this. Now the next thing I'm going to do here is the Woodland Scenic's gravel comes with a dirt mixer with it that kind of gives it a more realistic. So I'm going to kind of sprinkle this all over the gravel area and even on the tracks too. These tracks are supposed to look a little bit more disused. They're not mainline tracks, it's a spur, and a lot of these times they're not too well kept up. So this is just going to kind of lean into that idea that this isn't the most well kept little spur. So we're going to make this nice and dusty and get this all evened out and blend it in as best as we can and just kind of swirl it around until we get a good look. Now it's time to weather the roads, and what we're going to do is basically kind of weather the center line of the roads and let it spread out a little bit, but basically kind of where all of the dripping off of cars, tire dust, like brake dust, all that kind of stuff is going to collect off of that. So we're just going to kind of run down the lines of the lanes and we're just going to go back and forth. We're going to leave the center turn lane a little bit less weathered, but that's going to basically just give the idea that the road has been well used, and we're just going to go straight across the crossing with it and everything. Now, one thing you'll also notice is that when I get to the intersection up here, I do some of the turns as well to make it look like a well-worn turn. I kind of just follow the road.
And last but not least, the buildings.
Now we can remove that masking tape, and you can see it did a pretty good job of holding those lines. A few spots I'm going to have to touch up, but overall I am super happy with the results. These are going to look good on my layout. I placed the 3 buildings on there. This isn't going to be the absolute final placement, so I have to do some work to them. But yeah, this looks really, really good. I'm really happy with the way this turns out. And here is my picture for frame of reference, by the way.
This is the last module of this phase of my layout, and this has been a 1.5-year journey to get to this point, and I'm excited to get on the next phase of the journey of this layout. But it's kind of like closing a book on a part, because this has been my entire focus for the past 18 months, even longer. So let's get into the final module. For this module, we're going to be doing the more industrial side of downtown Elkin. There's a steel fabrication facility that builds like steel buildings, carports, things like that. So they get a lot of rolled steel. So you're going to see some coil steel cars and things like that, as well as other things that bring in different products. So that's what we're going to be building here. So let's get right into it.
This is the module that we're going to be working on. It is a T-Trak double module, and it's going to have a steel fabrication industry that builds metal buildings. So you're going to be getting a lot of steel coil cars as well as various cars for the different product. We're also going to be storing some locomotives for local switching here as well, which is why there are 2 sidings. So let's go ahead and get started with the build. The first thing that we need to do is we need to get this area that's going to mesh with my Thunderstorm module. So we need to build a hillside. Now I'm not going to have the hillside be quite as big, but we're going to do this with a little bit of extruded foam. And this is about the simplest hill that you can build. I just have a scrap sheet that I've used for holes for trees. I'm just going to draw the exact shape that I need, and I'm cutting a single layer of foam. This is very simple and should work out just fine. Next up, we're going to use some hot glue to attach this, so just kind of getting it everywhere it is needed. This usually works really great for me, and then we're just going to tuck it right in place right there. Now, one quick thing that I needed to do before I really get into this is I needed to fix up some wiring. I had some wires become disconnected, so I went ahead and fixed these before I really got going into scenicking this module. This is a really big benefit to the modular setup. I didn't have to crawl under any tables or anything like that. I just unclicked the module and did the work. Now I'm using a sheet of styrene that's going to be doing the parking lot work here, and I just need to make sure that it fits just fine. And then I'm also going to grab the building that I'm going to place. This is that warehouse that I have used on 2 layouts now, and then I go ahead and take everything off and get everything painted that uniform brown. Now if you're not comfortable with painting around the track, you can always tape it off and you can remove the backdrop, but I was pretty comfortable doing this, so I just went to town. I did need to paint my styrene to look like asphalt, and the way that I do that typically is I actually give it a base coat of gray, and I make that like a nice even coat, and then I come back with a can of black spray paint, matte black spray paint, and I kind of do it unevenly so that it looks a little worn and weathered, but it gets those darker tones that asphalt has. So it's just a matter of looking until you feel like you got it just right, but that's how I typically do it. Now it's time to glue that parking lot in place before we do any more scenery work, and I'm just using some white glue. In this case I got Mod Podge Matte Medium, and I'm just going to spread it around underneath where the parking lot is going to go. So I use a brush, do that, and then I'm just going to place the parking lot on top of it. I didn't really need to weigh this down. I was kind of surprised. It just kind of stuck there once I was good to go, and let that dry. Now, if you've ever seen my ballast process for Arduino track, it's fairly simple and straightforward. The way that I do this is I always start off with a line of white glue along the base of the road bed. I make sure not to get it on the ties or anything. I don't want anything sticking on top of the ties or on the rails or anything like that. And I'm just going to ballast the sides. I don't ballast the middle. I sometimes will do that if I'm working on a smaller space, but that's extremely tedious. But the weathering will usually take care of it that I do later. So I spread along and get the nice line, and then I use the cap from my Woodland Scenics Fine Ballast in a medium gray, and I just sprinkle it along the edge right there, and then I use another brush, just kind of shape it and get it the exact way that I want it. In this case, I needed to add a gravel area in between the sidings right here, so I did that as well. And then I just glue it down. I start by soaking it with some 90% IPA, that's isopropyl alcohol, and I just mist that over. And then I use a mixture of about 35 to 30% white glue and water with the rest of it, with a little bit of dish soap in it, and that's just lets it soak in really, really well and gets a nice hard crust, and then I just let that dry. Now Now once that was done, I used some of the dust and the weathering powder that comes with the Woodland Scenics gravel that I used, and I used it to weather up the tracks just a little bit, make them a little bit more dusty and less kept up. Now, if you've ever seen me do this before, we're doing our scenic base right here, and I'm doing it along the front because I gotta do a little bit more work in the back, but we're gonna start in the front right here. And what I do is I start off by putting that glue down to hold that down, then I use Woodland Scenics Earth Blend to give me a nice base. And once that is done, I can then sprinkle some blended turf in the green colors to make a good little brown-green mixture, because like I've said many times before, nature isn't a uniform color. It's a mix of browns and greens and all sorts of different colors. So that's really what you want to do there. Then once that is done, I can come back with some coarse turf, and that's going to give us some weeds and stuff and that kind of growth, and it's going to look more natural. And once that is done, I soak it with the IPA and my scenic glue mixture. Now we're going to work on the hillside, and what we have to do with the hillside is we have to completely cover the fact up that I just put a piece of foam right there. So we're going to completely cover this in vegetation. Now the way we start that is we put white glue all over this area because we're going to need to put a scenic base on it as well. So the exact same process as that little front strip we just did. Now in the area next to the tracks, we're going to go ahead and use our Woodland Scenics gravel. That is because that's going to be like a work area where different vehicles are driving to and from the tracks and right around that area. So we really need that to be more gravel and something that's used for the purposes of the steel fabrication plant. Then we're going to use a little bit more gravel along the back edge here just to give this a nice little edge where we have the difference between the pavement and the dirt. Now we need to cover up that really abrupt cliff face basically right there. We're going to start by just throwing a little bit of coarse turf out of what I have left in a bag. I just did that for reasons. But the thing we're going to use here to cover this up is clump foliage, and we're using kind of a medium green color. This particular one's from JTT Scenery. Woodland Scenics makes plenty of this as well. And we're going to take this and we're just going to stick it along that glue right there and completely fill up that little cliff face right there so that it is not visible at all. And this is the beginning of building up to where we have a completely vegetation covered hillside, as at least by appearances. Next, we're going to take some Woodland Scenics fine leaf foliage. This is very similar to Super Trees, except it comes pre-made, and we're going to stick it along the edges back there. You can break this up, and you can stick it just about anywhere. It's really good for making trees that are like coming out of vegetation, like I'm doing right here. It's also good just for doing all sorts of trees in general. So this is really good for deciduous, anything like that that you find in the southern United States. So we're just going to kind of fill this area with different heights of this fine leaf foliage. Now it's time to put in the tree canopy, and for this I'm using a Woodland Scenics Forest Canopy. This is basically sedum stems that you put coarse turf all over, and I have a little box that I keep everything in because a lot of times I don't use the entire box that it comes in. Sometimes I do, but I like to be able to keep and use this supplies as I need them. So I'm using a box that I've already opened, and I've got a lot of the materials that I've kept and collected. So we're basically just going to make a bunch of these and just stick them right in the ground while the glue is still wet, and we're going to fill in a nice canopy. Now the way that I like to do this is I like to do the bigger ones to the smaller ones, but I also like to have one, maybe two, that really kind of protrude out a little bit. So when you're doing this, just kind of try to fill it in, but also make sure you have a few little prominent trees so that it looks a little bit more realistic and it's not just a uniform canopy. Once you've got all this done, you can soak this entire area in your IPA and white glue water mixture. And then while that is drying, I actually like to sprinkle coarse turf over it just to kind of really give it that unkept look. This isn't a perfectly mowed and manicured area. This is the area behind an industrial facility that they don't really use and they don't really care about. So we're going to go ahead and fill that in as much as possible with some coarse turf to where it still looks good though. Well, once that is done, we can do the same thing and soak the coarse turf with that IPA and glue mixture. Next up, we need to put an extension of the road. So what I did was the road that I built on the previous module, I'll link that at the end of this video, I made a little extension in Tinkercad and 3D printed it out. Then once I had it, I went ahead and put some tacky glue on it, just like the previous sections, and I glued it in place. Now this is a bit of an overhang that goes on to the next module, but this is not a T-Trak layout that's designed to go a ton of places, so I'm not too worried about it. But we do that, and then we can put gravel on it right up to the edge, and we can start to blend it into the scenery, which basically is just work it till you think it looks right. That's basically what I do. And then towards the end of that, I'm going to start mixing in some earth blends and some blended green textures for the fine foam that I'm using, and that's going to really start to blend it in really nicely. And then finally, I'm going to put in some coarse turf and things like that. That's also going to hide the seam in the module, and it will make it look like it's a bunch of overgrowth. And once I have all of that done, I can soak the entire thing in isopropyl alcohol and then my scenic glue mixture, and then we're getting pretty close on this module. It's starting to look pretty good. Now on to one of the last things that I do, but is also one of the most effective in making this look real, and that's weathering. I've got my weathering powders right here. I have a metal black, a rust color, and a silver color, and what I use here is I put typically the black in the middle of the track, and I also use it to dirty up the sides, but really where all the dust, dirt, and grime falls from the locomotives, right there in the middle, and I'll use the rust color on the sides of the ties and just give it a mix of dirt and things like that. Now the interesting thing here is going to come up when I use the silver here in just a second on the roads. Now when I do the roads, I take the black and I do it in the direction that cars would travel, so it just looks like stuff that's fallen off the car. And then I'm going to weather it and blend it into the side right here. And then I'm going to use the silver to kind of do tire streaks and driving streaks all over the asphalt and just make it look a little bit more realistic. All right, and here is the completed base level of this module. I say base level because I'll talk a little bit more about that after this.
I think it's about time that I gave you guys a tour of my model railroad. This is the completed phase 2 of my N-scale T-Trak model railroad. It is roughly 6.5 feet by 9 feet, and it's got loads of features. But the first thing we need to do is we need to take a look at the track plan so you guys can get an idea of how this thing flows. This is the track plan, and it is broken up into 5 main areas. That is Rural Hall, the OSB board plant, the Riverbend area, Elkin, and staging. And we're going to be going through all of these areas in sequence from east to west, which is kind of weird because it's kind of the reverse of what you would think of from this direction. But imagine that you were looking at this from where the bottom of the screen is the south and the top of the screen is the north. So the east is going to start off in Rural Hall. Let's go ahead and take a look. Rural Hall is actually a real town in North Carolina. In this particular case, I'm doing a little bit of freelance and taking a few liberties. It is 2 T-Trak double sections, and it has a few buildings around it. It also has a engine servicing facility that I'm working on for the Blue Ridge and Western. And what it is basically, it is the entrance to everything. It's basically everything runs around here. It's also got one end of the runaround track that services all of the industries on the other side of this particular peninsula. The big turn here is actually the first module I completed for this layout. It's one of my favorite things that I've ever done, and it's just really that negative space. It doesn't serve anything other than getting from point A to point B, and it's just a scenic wooden scene. It's also one of my favorites to take photos of trains on my layout with, so it's the best rail fanning spot. Coming out of the big turn, we go through a double crossover, which is the other end of that runaround track, and then we come to the OSB board plant. Now, this is the largest single industry I have put on this layout so far, and it has some 3D printed details going on. I'm still working on that, but this is going to be an ongoing project throughout. It's already got some details on it, but I can't wait to get this finished up. I think it's going to be one of the cooler looking industries that I've ever done, so still got some work to do on it. The Riverbend area is meant to represent several of these feed mills that are along the riverbanks of the Yadkin River and where the track kind of snakes along near where the riverbank is. So the track isn't straight, it's kind of weaving its way, kind of following the path of the river. I've actually got a drone shot of that I'll put up real quick. And you can see that it also has the I-77 overpass that is going over the track. This is exactly what it's like on the actual scene where this is, and you also have the bridges that aren't the same size. But this is the Riverbend area. I've got some cool plans for it as well. Elkin is a town that I tried to get a little bit closer to the prototype than the other ones. Matter of fact, this crossing right here is meant to imitate this crossing right here in Elkin. You can see I actually feel like it did an okay job with it. Obviously, it's not perfect, but also you have this industry right here, which is Elkin Steel, and this is what it looks like in real life. And what they do is they basically make steel fabricated buildings, so like metal sheds and things like that. And that is what I have there. I've also got this little tributary into the Yadkin River. This is not meant to be the Yadkin River, but a little tributary that's on the west side of downtown. Now the town itself has another siding in addition to the steelworks, and that is a T-Trak. I'm going to use that as a transload facility, so you'll be able to see tankers, boxcars, all sorts of things right there. My entrance to staging is actually my Thunderstorm module that I built a long time ago. It's really meant to represent, if you're in North Carolina, thunderstorms really roll off the mountains in the western part of the state. So this is what this is meant to represent, and it kind of covers the entrance to staging, which I wouldn't necessarily call it full-blown staging. It's more of like a fiddle track staging hybrid, and yes, it's a little messy back there. But I do have a tablet that I run Engine Driver on, so that if I need to control trains directly from there, I can do that. You can see I have another train ready to go, and this also loops around to the beginning, and it comes out. You can see it come out underneath I-77 in that area and runs along the back and then ends up in Rural Hall. So this is the completion of phase 2 of this layout. I do have a phase 3 planned, and it's going to be something interesting. I'm going to be looking at modeling some kind of branch line, so you're going to want to be on the lookout for that.
Now, I don't want to give away much on phase 3 because I actually don't even know if my actual phase 3 plan is going to work, so that's kind of scary, so I don't want to say anything with it. But I still have some other projects I need to get done. I need to get the OSB board plant completed. I am swapping out the feed mill with a completely custom feed mill, and I've also got some other stuff to do in terms of detailing and weathering for the town of Elkin. I also want to do a proper engine maintenance facility for the track over in Rural Hall. So I still have a lot of projects that I need to get done, but I would consider the layout functionally complete. I just have scenery and detailing left to do. Now, like I said, phase 3, that's going to be a whole new thing, and if it works out, it should be something very interesting because I don't think that I have seen it before. So yeah, should be really, really interesting. So thank you all so much for watching. Until next time, I'm Jimmy from the DIY and Digital. Stay safe, be kind, and happy railroading.